Imagine you are sitting by a fire, not a modern gas hearth that clicks on with a switch, but something older, something earned. The light flickers against a rough wall of limestone, casting long, dancing shadows that look like beasts trying to break free from the rock. The air around you is cold, a sharp, biting chill that smells of dried dust, pine resin, and ancient ice. You can hear the wind howling outside, moving across vast treeless plains, a sound that has not changed in 20,000 years. It is a lonely sound, a reminder of how much empty space lies between you and the next circle of warmth. This is where we begin. We often imagine that history is a solid road, paved and lit, leading directly from the past to us. We imagine that the change from the wild to the civilized happened suddenly, that one day humanity simply woke up, decided to plant wheat, build walls, and write down their names. It feels like a single moment of awakening, but the truth is slower, quieter, and far more unsettling. We are drifting back into the lost epoch, a time when human history goes silent, not because nothing happened, but because the primary voices of our ancestors were never recorded in ink or clay. We are stepping into the deep pause between the biology of our evolution and the biography of our civilizations. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, let your eyes adjust to the dimness. In this era, the world is vast, and humanity is a scattering of tiny sparks in a great dark room. It is a time when the only library is the mind of an elder, and the only map is a song sung to memorize the path of a river. We define history by the written word, usually starting around 3200 BCE in the sun-baked mud of Mesopotamia, where accountants first scratched symbols to count grain. Anything before that moment is relegated to the shadowland of prehistory. But this label is a deception. It suggests a lack of sophistication, a lack of drama, a lack of humanity. Yet, biologically, the people of the lost epoch are exactly like us. They have the same capacity for love, for jealousy, for abstract mathematics, and for grief. They watch the same moon, though perhaps it hangs a little brighter in a sky unpolluted by city lights. They feel the same fear when the fire dies down. The silence of this epoch is not an emptiness. It is a heavy velvet curtain drawn across a stage where a magnificent play is already being performed. We just arrived too late to hear the dialogue. As we sit here in this imaginary shelter, we must understand the scale of what is missing. For tens of thousands of years, humans live full, complex lives that leave almost no trace. A woman might discover a new way to weave grass into a watertight basket, a stroke of genius that saves her family from starvation. But if she does not pass that skill to her daughter, or if her tribe is scattered by a storm, the invention dies with her. It is a fragile chain. Knowledge in the lost epoch is not stored on shelves. It is stored in breath. It lives only as long as it is spoken. If a storyteller dies before the apprentice is ready, 1,000 years of history can vanish in a single winter night. This is the tension that vibrates in the air around us, the desperate need to remember in a world that is constantly trying to erase you. It seems that nature itself is the antagonist here, erasing footprints with wind and rain, grinding bones into dust, and swallowing entire campsites with rising tides. We are looking for ghosts. The verified facts of this time are few, often consisting of nothing more than a broken flint blade or a polished bead found deep in a cave floor. These are the debris of survival, the things that were too hard to rot. But thoughts do not fossilize. We cannot dig up a prayer. We cannot excavate a compromise between two warring tribes. We cannot brush the dirt off a lullaby. So we must listen to the silence itself. We must read the gaps. It is in these gaps that the lost epoch truly exists. It is the period roughly between the deep freeze of the last ice age and the sudden explosion of agriculture, a bridge of time that scientists and historians still debate with hushed intensity. Some call it the Epipaleolithic, others call it the Mesolithic, but names are just labels we stick on boxes we haven't opened yet. Inside the box, the air is moving, the climate is shifting. The great ice sheets that have pinned the northern hemisphere down for millennia are beginning to groan and crack. This is not a passive backdrop. The Earth is a character in this story, perhaps the loudest one of all. Imagine the ground beneath your feet trembling, not from an earthquake, but from the sheer weight of water shifting across the crust. As the ice melts, the oceans rise, not in a steady pour, but sometimes in violent pulses that consume coastlines within a single generation. The map of the world is fluid. Islands that are currently separated by seas are, in this time, connected by grassy bridges where herds of mammoths still wander, unaware that their era is ending. It is a world in flux, a world of false springs and sudden freezes, and in the middle of it all, small bands of people are watching the sky, trying to predict the unpredictable. They are the ultimate survivors, adapting to changes that would shatter our modern infrastructure in days. They do not have the luxury of denial. When the herds move, they must move. When the water rises, they must climb. There is a profound humility in this existence, a sense that humanity is not the master of the earth, but a guest, and a tenuous one at that. We are guests who have overstayed our welcome in the warmth, and the landlord is waking up. It brings a slight smile to think of how important we believe our written laws are, how permanent we think our stone capitals are, when our ancestors survived for eons with nothing but a spear and a story. They navigated by the stars and the seasons, possessing a mental map of their territory that was more detailed than any satellite image, because for them, a mistake in navigation meant death. They knew the medicinal properties of 100 plants by taste and smell. They knew the behavior of wolves and reindeer better than they knew themselves. This was not a primitive existence, it was a hyper-aware existence. To fall asleep in the LOST Epoch was to trust your kin explicitly, to know that someone was watching the dark while you drifted off. And as we drift with them now, moving deeper into this silent history, we begin to feel the temperature drop. The fire we imagined at the start is burning low. The shadows are getting longer. We are moving toward a moment in deep time when the world played a cruel trick on these watchers of the sky, a moment when the warming earth suddenly, violently turned back toward the cold. It is a mystery that still haunts climatologists, a sudden pivot that may have forced humanity out of the garden and into the grind of history. The wind outside our shelter changes pitch, becoming a shriek. The stars above seem to sharpen, cold and indifferent. Something is coming, something that will freeze the flow of time and test the resilience of the human spirit in ways we can scarcely imagine. The comfort of the fire is fading, and out in the darkness, the first snowflake of a 1,000-year winter begins to fall, unseen onto the dry, waiting earth. That single snowflake eventually becomes a blanket, and the blanket becomes a shroud, and over centuries that feel like seconds to the geology of the earth, the shroud hardens into a shield of blue-white armor that stretches from horizon to horizon. We are now fully submerged in the reality of the last glacial maximum, a time when the planet seems to be holding its breath, suspended in a deep crystalline slumber. To understand the scale of this world, we must strip away the familiar maps in our minds. Forget the cities of the north. Forget the forests of pine and oak that currently drape the shoulders of the continents. In this epoch, looking north means looking at a wall. Imagine standing on the edge of what we now call London or Chicago, and facing a cliff of solid ice that rises 1, perhaps 2 miles into the air. It is not merely a frozen lake, it is a mountain range of water, locked in a state of suspended animation, crushing the bedrock beneath it with such incomprehensible weight that the Earth's crust actually bows down, dented by the burden. This is a world where the ice is not just a feature of the landscape, it is the landscape. It creates its own weather, its own winds, its own strange gravity. Standing near the edge of the great ice sheets, the Laurentide in America, the Fennoscandian in Europe, you would feel a perpetual downdraft, a heavy, sinking wind called a katabatic wind, pouring off the glacial summit like a river of invisible cold, scouring the plains below. It is a harsh reality, Yet there is a terrifying beauty to it. The air in this epoch is clearer than anything we know today, scrubbed free of humidity and haze. The stars do not twinkle so much as burn, piercing the atmosphere with a hard, unwavering light. Because so much of the world's water is locked up in these glacial prisons, the sea levels have plummeted, retreating nearly 400 feet from where they are now. The continents have swollen, exposing vast shelves of land that are today lost beneath the waves. The world is drier, dustier, a place of golden grasses and gray scrub. This is the Mammoth Steppe, the world's largest biome, a continuous belt of cold, dry grassland stretching all the way from Spain across Eurasia, over the Bering Land Bridge, and into the Yukon. It is a superhighway for life, an open road encircling the top of the globe. Walking across it, you would not feel the crunch of deep snow, but rather the dry rustle of tough wind-blown grass and the sensation of hard permafrost ground that rings like iron under your heel. It is a quiet world, but it is not empty. Out of the twilight gloom, massive shapes emerge, creatures designed by evolution to withstand the freezing air. The woolly mammoth, a masterpiece of biological engineering, drifts through the mist like a ship at sea. Its coat is a thick matted fortress against the wind, its small ears tucked close to avoid frostbite, its tusks sweeping the snow away to find the dry grass beneath. To watch a herd of mammoths in the moonlight is to see the landscape itself moving, slow and majestic, breathing steam into the freezing night. They are the kings of this silence, accompanied by woolly rhinoceroses and cave lions, animals that seem mythical to us but were as real as the breath in your lungs. And somewhere in this vast freezing panorama, there are humans. We are there, tiny specks against the white and gold, huddled in the lee of a rock face, or tucked into a shelter made of mammoth bones and sod. It seems impossible that a creature evolved for the tropical savannas of Africa could survive here, in temperatures that can snap wood and freeze flesh in minutes. We have no fur, no blubber, no natural armor. By all rights, we should have retreated to the equator. But we did not. We adapted with a kind of desperate brilliance. This is the era where the true hero of human history appears, though it is not a warrior or a king. It is the eyed needle. Somewhere in the deep silence of the lost epoch, a hand carved a sliver of bone, drilled a tiny eye into one end, and changed the destiny of our species. With this simple tool, humans could sew. We stopped draping ourselves in skins and started tailoring them. We created complex layered clothing, an inner layer of soft fur facing in to trap air against the skin, and an outer layer of waterproof hide to shed the wind. We made hoods, mittens, boots lined with dried grass for insulation. It brings a gentle, knowing smile to think of us today, complaining about a drafty window or a chilly office, while our ancestors sat on the edge of a glacier, stitching airtight seams by the light of a lamp-burning animal fat. They turned themselves into artificial animals, stealing the warmth of the wolf and the bear to wrap around their own fragile bodies. This mastery of thermal engineering allowed us to inhabit the impossible. We followed the herds. We learned to read the ice. We learned that the glacier talks, that it groans and cracks as it moves, a sound like thunder coming from the ground, warning of crevasses or calving cliffs. Living so close to such immense power must have instilled a profound sense of scale in the human mind. The ice was eternal. The ice was a god. It had been there for as long as the grandfather's grandfather could remember, and it would surely be there forever. There was no concept of a world without the ice. It was the boundary of the known universe. Life in this freezer required a social closeness that we can scarcely imagine. To survive the long, dark winters, where the sun might barely crest the horizon for weeks, people had to rely on each other completely. Loneliness was a death sentence. The campfire became the center of the universe, the only point of light and heat in an endless dark. Here, stories were distilled, passed back and forth until every word held weight. The mythology of this time must have been filled with cold giants, with spirits of the wind, with the sun as a fickle friend who abandons the world. Yet, despite the hardship, there is evidence of abundance. The Mammoth Steppe was rich in protein. The herds were vast. Humans were not just scraping by. In some places they were thriving, growing tall and strong on a diet of meat and fat, their bones dense, their teeth worn but healthy. They were masters of their frozen domain, perfectly attuned to the rhythm of a slow glacial heartbeat. They moved with the seasons, anticipating the slight shifts in temperature, the migration of the caribou, the ripening of late summer berries. They did not know they were living in an ice age. To them it was simply the age. It was the only world there was. The silence of the landscape was not empty. It was heavy with presence. A hunter waiting for prey would lie perfectly still for hours, becoming a stone, letting the frost settle on his eyelashes, listening to the crunch of footsteps a mile away. In this heightened state of awareness, the line between man and nature blurs. You are not separate from the cold. You are part of it. You respect it because you know it can claim you at any moment. As we watch this scene, looking down from the perspective of deep time, the stability feels absolute. The glaciers look permanent, anchor points of the Earth's geography. The coastline looks fixed. The rhythm of the hunt looks endless, but the Earth is a restless sleeper. Deep beneath the layers of ice, pressure is building. In the atmosphere, invisible balances are shifting. The tilt of the planet, the wobble of its orbit, the cycles of the sun, all are conspiring in a slow cosmic dance that the humans huddled by their fires cannot see. They feel the cold wind on their faces and pull their furs tighter, believing that tomorrow will be the same as yesterday, and that the ice will always watch over them. But the great white silence is deceptive. It is masking attention, a stored energy waiting to be released. The world is about to take a breath, a deep, warm inhalation that will shatter the crystalline stillness and unleash a chaos of water and life. The long winter, which has defined the human experience for tens of thousands of years, is approaching a tipping point. But for now, the ice holds. The stars burn cold, and the only sound is the wind, whistling over the miles of gray grass, singing a lullaby to a world that is about to wake up. And then, the sound of the world changed. If you had been standing in that frozen silence for long enough, the first thing you would have noticed was not the heat, but the noise. It started as a whisper, a rhythmic dripping pulse from the lip of the glacier, a tiny drumbeat of water hitting stone. Then, the whisper grew into a murmur, the murmur into a roar, and finally, the roar into a chaotic symphony of crashing ice and rushing rivers. We have entered the period known to science as the Booling Alarud interstadial. But to the humans living through it, it must have felt like a miraculous forgiveness. The Earth, which had been locked in a rigid, icy fist for 100,000 years, suddenly relaxed its grip. The change was geological, driven by the subtle mechanics of the planet's orbit, tilting the northern hemisphere just enough toward the sun to catch its warmth. To the people on the ground, however, it must have seemed as if the gods had woken up in a benevolent mood. The great ice sheets, those eternal walls of blue and white, began to retreat. They did not vanish overnight, of course. They withdrew slowly, agonizingly, pulling back toward the poles like a receding tide of glass. As they pulled back, they revealed a landscape that had been hidden for millennia. Raw, scraped bedrock, vast piles of gravel, and strange, scarred valleys. But nature abhors a vacuum. Almost immediately, life rushed in to fill the empty spaces. This is the era of the great thaw. The air grew heavy with moisture. The dry, biting wind of the mammoth steppe was replaced by soft, humid breezes that smelled of wet earth, decomposing leaves, and the sweet, heavy scent of pine resin. This was a profound transformation. The golden grasslands, which had supported the herds of mammoth and bison, began to fracture. In their place, forests erupted. First came the birch trees, their white bark gleaming like ghosts of the ice that had just left. Then came the pines, dark and dense, colonizing the hills. Then the oaks and hazels, marching north, reclaiming the land mile by mile. For the humans, this was a time of confusion and plenty. The old maps in their minds, the mental charts of where to find water and where the reindeer migrated, were becoming obsolete. The world was rewriting itself. The open plains where you could see a predator coming from 3 miles away were now cluttered with thickets and shadows. The herds of reindeer, confused by the encroaching forests, moved further north, chasing the retreating cold. The mammoth, that great majestic lord of the steppe, found itself in a tragic predicament. Its heavy coat was a burden in the new warmth, and its massive feet, perfect for hard permafrost, sank deep into the thawing mud. They began to fade, pushing into the last pockets of the old world, leaving the new world to the deer, the boar, and the smaller, swifter creatures of the woods. Humans, however, are the ultimate opportunists. We did not fade. We flourished. We shed the heavy, multi-layered furs and let the sun touch our skin. We reinvented our tools. The heavy spears meant for bringing down giants were replaced by lighter, more precise arrows and harpoons, tools designed for the darting shadows of the forest and the teeming life of the rivers. For the first time in eons, food was everywhere. The warming world was generous. Rivers, swollen with meltwater, were choked with salmon and trout. The new forests were full of berries, nuts, and roots. It seems that during this warm interval, the desperate edge of survival was dulled just a little. Perhaps people slept longer. Perhaps they played more. Perhaps with the pressure of freezing to death removed, they had time to sit by the river and wonder not just how to survive, but why they were surviving. It is tempting to view this era as a golden age, a Garden of Eden before the fall. The climate data tells us that temperatures in some parts of the world shot up to near-modern levels within just a few decades. It was a spring that lasted for 2,000 years. Think of that duration. 2,000 years is as long as the time between the Roman Empire and today. It was long enough for the memory of the Ice Age to fade into myth. Grandmothers would tell stories of a time when the world was white and the wind could freeze your breath, and children would listen with wide eyes, looking out at the green forest and the bright sun, thinking it was just a fairy tale. They believed the warmth was permanent. They believed the green world was the only world. Why wouldn't they? To them, the normal state of the earth was one of abundance and comfort. They expanded their range, pushing north into lands that had been buried under a mile of ice only a few generations before. They set up camps on the shores of new lakes, painting stones, carving amber, living with a sense of security that their ancestors never knew. It brings a faint sympathetic smile to think of them complaining about the new inconveniences, the clouds of mosquitoes rising from the bogs or the mud that tracked into everything, completely unaware that these were the luxury problems of a paradise. But this spring was a deception. It was a false promise whispered by a volatile climate. While humanity was basking in the sun, the earth was silently setting a trap. The very mechanism that created this warmth, the melting of the ice, was also creating the poison that would kill it. As the glaciers melted, they didn't just disappear. They turned into water. Billions of gallons of fresh cold water poured off the continents. In North America, a colossal lake formed, known today as Lake Agassiz. It was a vast inland sea of meltwater, held back by a dam of remaining ice. It sat there, shimmering and massive, pressing against its containment, waiting. The humans living near it likely saw it as a source of life, a great provider. They could not know that it was a loaded gun. The Earth's climate relies on a delicate circulation of ocean currents, a conveyor belt of warm, salty water moving north and cold, fresh water sinking south. It is the engine that keeps the northern hemisphere warm. But engines can flood. As the good times rolled on, the meltwater continued to pool, rising higher and higher, pressure building against the weakening ice dams. The humans of the fall spring were living on borrowed time, dancing on a floor that was slowly rotting beneath them. They had adapted to the forest, to the hunt of the deer, to the rhythm of the river. They had forgotten the old ways of the ice. They had forgotten how to survive the white silence. And the tragedy of the lost epoch is that comfort makes us vulnerable. When you are used to the struggle, you are ready for anything. When you are used to the warmth, the cold is a shock that can stop your heart. The sun continued to rise, warm and golden. The forests continued to thicken. The birds sang their songs of territory and mating, loud in the morning light. Everything felt solid. Everything felt eternal. But far to the north, the ice dam was groaning. The water was searching for a crack. The fall spring was reaching its end, and the bill for 2,000 years of warmth was about to come due. The pendulum of deep time had swung as far as it could toward the light, and now, heavy with the weight of the melt, it began its slow, terrifying swing back toward the dark. The listeners by the fire, the children who thought the ice was a myth, were about to learn that myths have a nasty habit of becoming real. The air grew still, the birds quieted, and the long, beautiful dream of the building Alarud began to dissolve, not into a gentle waking, but into a nightmare of returning cold. The change, when it finally arrived, did not come with a warning shout or a slow, polite transition. It came with the violence of a broken promise. We call this moment the Younger Dryas, a name that sounds dry and academic, referring to a small, hardy white flower, Dryas octopetala, that thrives in the cold tundra. But to the people who lived through it around 12,900 years ago, it must have felt like the sky itself was falling. It began, quite literally, with a rupture. Far to the north, the great ice dam holding back Lake Agassiz finally gave way. It is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend the scale of this release. Imagine a volume of water greater than all the Great Lakes combined, unleashed not over centuries, but in a catastrophic rush, pouring fresh, freezing water into the North Atlantic Ocean. This massive injection of cold water acted like a chemical brake on the ocean's circulation. The great conveyor belt of currents, the heartbeat of the planet that pulls warm tropical water north to heat the atmosphere, stuttered, slowed, and then stopped. The radiator of the world was turned off. The effect was almost immediate. In the span of a single human lifetime, perhaps even just a few years, the average temperature of the northern hemisphere plummeted by nearly 15 degrees Celsius. The fall spring was over. The door to the garden was slammed shut, and the lock turned. For the humans who had grown comfortable in the birch forests and the river valleys, the shock must have been absolute. Imagine the confusion of a generation that had never known true cold, suddenly watching the snows of winter fail to melt in June. Imagine the elders staring at the sky, waiting for the birds to return, only to find the air silent and empty. The green forests that had marched north during the warm years began to die, turning into ghost woods of gray, skeletal trunks that rattled in the returning wind. The lush, damp earth dried up and turned to dust. The winds picked up this dust and whipped it into blinding storms that scoured the land, blotting out the sun for days at a time. It was a return to the Ice Age, but with a cruel twist. It was a chaotic, unstable Ice Age. The weather was no longer the predictable deep freeze of the ancestors. It was volatile, angry, and erratic. This was the moment the Lost Epoch truly earned its name, for it is here that the thread of human progress seems to fray. We see settlements abandoned. We see the population numbers drop. We see a retreat from the open lands back into the shelter of caves and valleys. It is a period of intense contraction. The easy calories of the forest vanished. The nuts, the berries, the slow-moving forest deer, all gone. In their place, the cold-adapted herds returned, but they were different now, moving across a landscape that was broken and confusing. Humans had to relearn the art of shivering. It brings a somber, grounding thought to mind. We often believe that once technology or knowledge is gained, it can never be lost. We think progress is a ratchet that only turns one way. But the Younger Dryas proves us wrong. It is entirely possible that during this shock, we lost things. Perhaps we forgot the names of certain medicinal plants that no longer grew. Perhaps we lost the techniques for building light, airy summer shelters because they were now useless death traps. Perhaps we lost songs that celebrated the sun, replacing them with dirges for the warmth that had fled. The psychological impact of this event must have been devastating. If you believe that the world is alive, that the earth interacts with you, then this sudden freeze would feel like a punishment. What had they done wrong? Had they hunted too many deer? Had they forgotten the rituals? The gods who had been so generous during the warm Alarud period had suddenly turned their faces away. This likely sparked a crisis of faith, a desperate need to reorganize how humans interacted with the unseen forces of the cosmos. It is no coincidence that just as this cold snap begins to loosen its grip 1,000 years later, we see the first stirrings of monumental religion. But for now, there is only survival. The nights are long and bitterly cold. The technology of the needle and the tailored fur, which had perhaps fallen into disuse during the warm centuries, had to be resurrected. Grandparents guided the clumsy hands of their grandchildren, teaching them the old stitches, the old ways of scraping hide, the old ways of reading the ice. "Listen," they might have whispered, "this is how we survived before the world went soft." The younger Dryas forced humanity into a bottleneck. It squeezed us. And as any blacksmith knows, when you squeeze and hammer metal, it gets harder. The weak connections broke. The fragile communities that could not adapt dissolved into the snow. But those who remained became sharper, more focused, more efficient. We see evidence of this in the stone tools of the time. The points become smaller, more lethal, more precious. This is the era of the microlith. Tiny razor-sharp blades embedded in wood or bone handles. These were tools for a world of scarcity, designed to be easily repaired, designed to waste nothing. You can feel the tension in these artifacts. They are not the leisurely creations of a time of plenty, but the urgent, precise inventions of a species on the edge. The landscape itself shifted its palette. The vibrant greens and warm browns were painted over with whites, grays, and the muted olive of the tundra moss. The silence deepened. The soundscape of the younger Dryas was the sound of wind hissing through dry grass, the crack of freezing timber, and the crunch of snow that never leaves. It was a time of holding on. For 1,200 years, a span of time twice as long as the Roman Empire existed, humanity endured this return to the freezer. 1,200 years of grandmothers telling children that the world was once warm, and the children not believing them. 1,200 years of waiting for a spring that refused to come. It feels like a tragedy, this setbacks, this erasure of the progress made during the fall spring. But perhaps it was necessary. Perhaps the easy life of the warm period was a trap, a dead end that would have left us complacent. The younger Dryas woke us up. It reminded us that the earth is not a backdrop, but a formidable opponent that demands our respect. It forced us to band together tighter than ever before. If you could not trust your neighbor in the fall spring, you might just be lonely. If you could not trust your neighbor in the younger Dryas, you would die. The social bonds hardened. The tribes became singular organisms, moving and thinking as one. And so, the humans of the Lost Epoch huddled in their shelters, watching the erratic stars, their breath pluming in the freezing air, waiting. They did not know that this cold snap was the final exam, the last great test of the Paleolithic world before the climate would settle into the stability that would allow civilization to rise. They only knew that the sky had fallen and time had frozen. They only knew that to sleep was to trust the fire and to wake was to face the wind. And as the centuries dragged on, grinding the mountains down and polishing the stones of the riverbeds, the people learned the most important lesson of all, that the sun does not owe us anything. We earn our warmth. We steal it from the wood, we capture it in the fur, we hoard it in the stories we tell against the dark. The cold was a forge, and we were the iron, glowing red in the heat of our own resilience, waiting for the hammer to fall again, shaping us into something new, something ready for the next impossible chapter of the Earth's long, slow story. Motion becomes the only form of permanence. In this fractured, freezing world of the younger Dryas, to stay still is to starve, and so the great stillness of the ice is countered by the great movement of the blood. We are entering the era of the Great Migration, not as a singular event with a start and a finish line, but as a state of being. Entire populations, both human and animal, are becoming fluid, pouring slowly across the surface of the earth like water, seeking a lower level. The map of the world in this moment is unrecognizable to modern eyes because the oceans are still holding their breath, their waters locked away in the glaciers. This exposes vast secret highways of land that connect the continents, phantom geographies that will later vanish beneath the waves. The most famous of these is Beringia, often described in textbooks as a land bridge, a term that feels far too narrow, too functional. It suggests a simple causeway, a plank thrown across a ditch that one hurries across to get to the other side. But Beringia is not a bridge. It is a lost subcontinent, a sprawling territory of dry steppe and tundra, twice the size of Texas, sitting right where the Bering Strait is today. It is a world unto itself, a flat, grassy plain teeming with life, where the wind blows uninterrupted for 1,000 miles. Imagine standing in the center of what is now the cold, churning Bering Sea. Instead of water, you are standing on firm, dry earth, surrounded by a sea of sagebrush and sedge. To your west lies the mass of Siberia. To your east, the glaciers of North America block the way like a wall of white clouds. You are in the bottleneck of humanity, a refuge where the genetic destiny of a hemisphere is being incubated. It is here that a profound mystery unfolds, one that archaeologists and geneticists still debate with quiet fascination. Did the ancestors of the Americas simply march through this land, driven by a need for new horizons? Or did they pause here? There is a growing consensus that they stopped, that for perhaps 5,000 years this bridge was actually a home. This is the Beringian standstill, a pause in the journey where a unique culture cooked in the isolation of the high latitudes. It brings a gentle, ironic smile to think of them stuck there, perhaps complaining that there was nowhere else to go, completely unaware that they were standing on the doorstep of 2 empty continents waiting to be filled. They are not trying to discover America. They are simply trying to find a place where the wind is less cruel and the caribou are more plentiful. The migration is not a straight line on a map. It is a tangled web of seasonal rounds, of moving camp when the willow thickets are exhausted, of following the scent of rain. It is a slow drift. A family might move only 10 miles in a generation, but over deep time, those 10 miles add up to the crossing of worlds. The experience of this migration is one of profound exposure. There are no forests here to hide in, only the endless rolling scrub. The sky is a vast, crushing dome. When the sun sets, it does not dip below a jagged skyline of mountains, but melts into the flat edge of the earth, lingering for hours in a bruised purple twilight. The silence is different here too. It is the silence of distance. You can see a storm coming for 2 days before it hits you. You can see the herds of bison and horse moving like dark rivers across the gold, their dust plumes rising like smoke signals. The humans moving with them are quiet, efficient. They carry everything they own on their backs or on dragged sledges, heirloom skins, precious cores of flint, the smoldering embers of the hearth carried in horn containers. Every object must justify its weight. There is no room for sentimentality in the pack, yet we find they still carried flute-like instruments made of bird bone and delicate beads of ostrich eggshell. It seems that music and beauty were as essential to survival as the spear. Perhaps the song was what lightened the load. As they walk, they are navigating a landscape of ghosts. They are walking over land that will, in a blink of geological time, become the floor of the ocean. The campfires they build, the stones they chip, the graves they dig, all of it is destined to be drowned. There is a melancholy beauty in this, a sense that we are watching a performance on a stage that is about to be struck, but the actors do not know it. To them, this earth is solid. It is the only earth they know. They track the migrations of the beasts with an intimacy we have lost. They do not just follow the animals, they predict them. They know that the saiga antelope, with its strange bulbous nose, will seek the lower valleys when the frost hits. They know that the mammoth will move toward the river willows. The human migration is tethered to the animal migration. We are not yet the masters of the world. We are the shadow of the herd. We move when they move. We starve when they vanish. This dependency creates a spiritual bond, a sense of shared destiny. When a hunter takes a life, It is a transaction between equals, a somber exchange of energy in a landscape that offers nothing for free. And it is not just the land bridge that is busy. Across the globe, in the cooling, drying world of the Lost Epoch, humans are on the move. In Europe, they are following the reindeer north as the ice retreats, and then south again as the younger Dryas bites, a pendulum of survival. In Africa, the drying of the Sahara is forcing populations to contract toward the Nile and the coasts, squeezing distinct cultures together, sparking new languages and new tensions. The world is in a state of flux. The old territories are dissolving. The old treaties with the land are being rewritten. It is a time of meeting. Strangers encounter strangers at the edges of the habitable zones. We can imagine these moments, the tension of seeing a silhouette on the ridge that is not kin, not clan, but something else. Is it a threat? Is it a trade? Is it a mate? The genetic history of humanity tells us that we mixed, we mingled, we merged. The isolation of the deep past was breaking down. Ideas were beginning to flow as fast as the people. A new way of flaking stone, a new way of preserving meat, a new word for star. These things traveled across the human web, carried by the restless feet of the migration. The wind howls over the steppe, a constant physical pressure against the chest. It dries the skin and cracks the lips. It carries the scent of ice from the north and the faint salty tang of the distant, hesitant ocean. The ocean is the great unknown boundary. In this epoch, the coastlines are miles further out than they are today. To find the sea, you would have to walk past the modern beaches, past the modern fishing grounds, out onto the continental shelf. The waves break on shores that are now deep underwater canyons. The people of the migration walk along these lost coasts, gathering shellfish, watching the gray water, perhaps sensing that the ocean is a sleeping giant, waiting to reclaim its territory. They are marginal people, living on the edges of the habitable world, pushed by the cold and pulled by the hope of warmth. They are the ultimate explorers, not because they seek glory, but because they seek dinner. And as they move, step by heavy step across the land bridges and the drying plains, they are unknowingly carrying the seeds of the future into the fertile soils of the new world. They are the delivery system for the human virus, spreading to every corner of the globe, filling the empty spaces. But as they move into these new lands, they find they are not alone. The landscape is occupied by titans. The darkness ahead of them is filled with heavy breathing, with the snap of branches, with the rumble of digestion that belongs to creatures of nightmare and majesty. The migration is leading them directly into the domain of the megafauna, the giant beasts whose time is running out. The humans are walking toward a collision, a meeting of the hungry new world and the ancient, dying old world. The wind drops for a moment, and in the sudden silence, you can hear it. Not the wind, but the heavy rhythmic thud of 1,000 tons of life moving in the dark. The great migration is about to meet the great extinction. When the giants leave, the silence they leave behind is heavier than the noise they made while they were here. We are entering the chapter of the great vanishing, a period in the Lost Epoch where the biological resolution of the planet was dialed down from the majestic and the monstrous to the merely human. For millions of years, the Earth was a planet of giants. If you were to walk through the Americas or Eurasia in this time, you would not be the master of the terrain. You would be a squirrel scurrying between the feet of titans. This was the norm. To be large was the successful strategy. But as the younger Dryas gripped the world and the climate oscillated with violent unpredictability, something broke in the biological contract. The megafauna, the animals weighing over 1,000 pounds, began to fade into the mist. It is a ghost story written in the fossil record. Imagine the ground sloth, a creature the size of an elephant but shaped like a bear, moving with a slow, hypnotic grace through the open woodlands. It could stand on its hind legs and peer into the second-story window of a house that had not yet been built, using massive curved claws to pull down entire tree branches like we might pluck a grape. It was a creature of such gentle, plodding immensity that it seems impossible it could ever be threatened. It had no natural predators, until it did. Then there was the glyptodon, a chaotic mix of a turtle and a tank, an armadillo the size of a Volkswagen Beetle rumbling across the marshes, and of course the woolly mammoth, the iconic anchor of the epoch. These were not just animals. They were landscapes. They were ecosystem engineers. By simply walking, they knocked down trees, keeping the forests open and allowing the grasses of the steppe to flourish. They churned the soil with their tusks. They transported nutrients over hundreds of miles. The world was shaped by their weight, and then, in a geological blink, they were gone. The question of why is one of the great soft arguments of science, a debate that is yet to be settled. Some argue it was the climate, that the rapid seesaw from the warm fall spring to the freezing younger Dryas destroyed the habitats they relied on, trapping them in pockets of vegetation that were too small to sustain their massive appetites. They simply starved in a world that changed too fast for their slow generational cycles. Others look at the timing, the suspicious coincidence that these extinctions often align perfectly with the arrival of humans. This is the overkill hypothesis, a term that sounds violent and accusatory, suggesting that our ancestors, armed with their new, lethal microlith spear points, hunted these gods into oblivion. It is an uncomfortable thought that the first mark humanity left on the global stage was an erasure. But the truth, as is so often the case in the deep past, is likely a quiet, complex tragedy of both. It seems probable that the climate stressed the populations, thinning the herds, pushing them to the brink, and humans simply delivered the final unintended nudge. We were not villains. We were just another pressure in a world that had run out of room for error. We hunted the mothers. We took the calves. We did not understand the math of extinction. We only understood the math of hunger. It brings a faint, sad smile to imagine a clan celebrating a successful mammoth hunt, feasting on tons of meat that would see them through the winter, completely unaware that they had just eaten the very last breeding female of a local herd, and that the valley would never hear that trumpet again. The vanishing was not a single dramatic event. It was a flickering out. It was a hunter tracking a herd of giant elk for 3 days, only to find the tracks ending in a snowdrift. It was a child asking where the longnoses went, and the grandfather shrugging, looking at the empty horizon, saying they must have moved to the moon. The loss was profound. With the giants gone, the landscape itself began to close in. Without the mammoths to trample the saplings, the birch and pine forests surged forward, choking the open grasslands. The world became darker, more cluttered, harder to navigate. The view was blocked. The open highways of the steppe were closed for repairs that would last 10,000 years. For the humans left behind, the psychological impact must have been disorienting. They had defined themselves against these monsters. Their art, their stories, their calendar, all revolved around the life cycles of the beasts. Now, the stage was empty. Humanity was suddenly the biggest thing on the block. This shift in scale likely forced a shift in theology. When you live among giants, you are humble. You are a guest. When the giants die, you become the steward, or perhaps the owner. The silence of the megafauna may have been the moment humanity began to think of the earth as something to be conquered rather than feared. We see this reflected in the art. The cave paintings of animals, dynamic, beautiful, full of soul, begin to fade, replaced by more abstract symbols or scenes of human conflict. The focus turns inward, but the memory of the beasts lingered. It is possible that the dragons and monsters of our later myths are the distorted, dreamlike memories of these lost companions. A story about a hero slaying a great beast with a spear might be a 400-generation-old echo of a mammoth hunt, passed down until the mammoth became a dragon and the flint spear became a magic sword. The reality of the lost epoch is that we are living in a depleted world. We are walking through a zoo where the cages of the lions and elephants are empty, and only the mice and foxes remain. We have grown used to this emptiness. We think it is normal for the woods to be quiet. But if you listen closely to the wind on the high plains, you can almost hear the phantom rhythm of the past, the deep subsonic rumble of digestion, the crack of falling timber, the heavy, earth-shaking footsteps of the lost kings and queens of the Pleistocene. They are gone. but the ecological hole they left is still there, a silhouette cut out of the web of life. And as the last mammoth took its final breath on some lonely, windswept island unrelated to the mainland, the chapter of the monsters closed. The world was now smaller, quieter, and infinitely more lonely. The humans, shivering in their furs, had survived the competition, but at what cost? They were now alone in the dark, with no one to watch but themselves. The disappearance of the megafauna also meant the disappearance of easy meat. The fast food of the Paleolithic, the slow, lumbering giants, was off the menu. Now, survival meant working harder. It meant chasing swift red deer through dense forests. It meant trapping small game. It meant looking down at the ground, at the roots and the seeds and the grasses, and wondering if perhaps there was another way to feed the tribe, a way that didn't involve chasing ghosts across a dying landscape. The pressure was mounting. The climate was still erratic, the big game was gone, and the populations, though battered, were persisting. The stage was being set for a radical reinvention, but before the seed could be sown, another transformation had to occur. The water, which had been locked away in the ice, was continuing its restless rebellion. The coastlines, which had served as the great highways for the migration, were about to betray the walkers. The ocean was coming back, not just to fill the basins, but to steal the history. The places where the people of the Lost Epoch had lived most densely, the fertile, low-lying coastal plains, were about to be erased from the map entirely. We turn our gaze now from the empty plains to the rising tide, watching as the blue water begins to lap at the edges of the campfire, bringing with it a salt-heavy message of change. The land itself is about to become a memory, and the map of the world will be redrawn by the relentless rising hand of the sea. If you were to stand on the high chalk cliffs of Dover today, looking out across the gray, churning waters of the English Channel toward France, you would see a barrier. The sea is a border, a moat that separates nations and defines the edge of the world. But in the Lost Epoch, if you stood on those same white cliffs, you would not see water. You would look down into a vast, lush valley, a green heartland teeming with red deer and wild boar, winding rivers and smoking campfires. You would see the smoke of your neighbors rising from the lowlands that we now call the bottom of the North Sea. This is the story of the Great Drowning, the silent, relentless theft of the ancestral coasts. As the ice sheets continued to melt, the water had to go somewhere. It returned to the oceans, raising global sea levels by nearly 400 feet. But numbers are abstract. They do not capture the heartbreak of the reality. This was not a Hollywood tidal wave that swallowed continents in an afternoon. It was something far more psychological, far more haunting. It was a slow, generational creeping. It was the grandfather taking his grandson to the beach and saying, "When I was a boy, the ocean was a day's walk away. Now, it is here at our feet." It was the gradual poisoning of the freshwater wells by the encroaching salt. It was the oak trees at the edge of the forest, turning yellow and dying as their roots touched the brackish water, creating ghost forests of bleached skeletal wood standing in the tide. The most poignant victim of this rising water was a place archaeologists call Doggerland. Today, it is just a name on a jagged map of the seafloor, a hazard for oil rigs and trawlers. But 10,000 years ago, Doggerland was the Europe that could have been. It was a bridge of low-lying, fertile land connecting Britain to the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany. It was not a marginal place. It was likely the most populated, richest environment in the region, a paradise of wetlands, lagoons, and meandering rivers. The people who lived there did not know they were living on a land bridge. To them, it was simply the world. It was the place where the ancestors were buried. It was the place where the best hazels grew. And slowly, inexorably, the world began to shrink. Imagine the tension of living on land that is visibly disappearing. Every storm that battered the coast would take another chunk of the dunes, and the land would never give it back. The geography was closing in. This must have created a profound sense of claustrophobia and displacement. The tribes of the lowlands were forced to retreat, moving higher, pushing into the territories of the inland people. We can imagine the quiet conflicts, the uncomfortable negotiations around the fire. The water has taken our hunting grounds, they might say. We must share yours. It was a refugee crisis played out in slow motion over thousands of years. The map was not a fixed thing. It was a dying animal, retreating from the rising blue. While much of this rise was gradual, a stealthy thief in the night, there were moments of sudden, terrifying violence. About 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide occurred off the coast of Norway, known today as the Storegga Slide. A chunk of the continental shelf the size of Iceland collapsed into the deep ocean. This displacement sent a tsunami racing across the North Atlantic. For the people of Doggerland, who were already living on a shrinking marshy island, there was no warning. The sea simply heaved. A wall of gray water, perhaps 20 meters high, swept over the low-lying plains, devastating the coastlines of Scotland, England, and the remaining heart of Doggerland. It was a hammer blow to a drowning world. Entire communities would have been erased in a heartbeat, their fires extinguished, their tools scattered in the silt. It brings a somber stillness to realize that for some, the end of the world did not come with fire, but with a cold, rushing wall of salt. After the water receded, the landscape was poisoned, the soil stripped. It was the final notice of eviction. The few survivors retreated to the high ground, to the hills of what would become Britain and the plains of what would become Europe. The great connection was broken. Britain became an island cut off from the mainland, drifting into its own solitary history. The loss of Doggerland is a trauma that has been completely erased from our conscious history, yet it persists in the debris. Today, modern fishing trawlers in the North Sea frequently pull up strange catch in their nets. They do not catch just cod and haddock, they catch the bones of lions. They catch mammoth tusks, they catch delicate barbed harpoons carved from antler, still sharp after 10 millennia in the dark. These are the heirlooms of the drowned, the lost possessions of a culture that was forced to walk away from its home. It is a haunting thought that beneath the waves of the North Sea, there are likely perfectly preserved campsites, hearths where the charcoal is still black, footprints pressed into the ancient mud, all sealed under layers of marine sediment. It is a Pompeii of the prehistoric North, not buried by ash, but by the relentless patience of the ocean. This era of rising seas reshaped the human psyche. It taught us that land is not permanent. It planted the seed of a deep ancestral fear of the flood. It is likely that the stories of this time, the stories of the great water that swallowed the earth, were passed down, whispered from generation to generation, evolving, changing, until they eventually found their way into the clay tablets of Sumer and the verses of the Bible. The story of Noah, of Utnapishtim, of the great deluge. These are not just parables of divine judgment, they are the distorted, mythologized memories of the ice melting. They are the trauma of the Doggerland refugees echoing down the corridors of time. As the waters stabilized, the map of the world looked much like it does today. The continents were defined, the islands were isolated, the great open highways of the LOST Epoch were gone. Humanity was compartmentalized, separated by seas that were no longer barriers of ice, but barriers of water. This separation forced cultures to diverge. The people of Britain, isolated by the Channel, developed their own way of doing things, distinct from their cousins in France. The rising sea created diversity by creating distance, but for the people of the time, it must have felt only like loss. We can picture an elder standing on the newly formed cliffs of Dover, looking east toward a horizon that was once a valley of trees, now just an endless, flat line of gray water. They might point to a spot in the waves and say, "That is where I was born. That is where my mother sleeps." And the child would look and see only the sea. The ocean keeps its secrets well. It does not explain. It simply takes. And so, the humans of the post-glacial world turned their backs on the lost lands and looked inland. They looked to the rivers, to the hills, to the deep forests that still remained. They had survived the freeze. They had survived the thaw. They had survived the drowning. They were harder now, more adaptable, carrying the heavy knowledge that the earth changes and that safety is an illusion. The water had set the boundaries of their new world, drawing the lines where civilization would eventually rise. But before cities could be built, something else had to happen. The wandering had to stop. The great endless walk of the hunter-gatherer was approaching a crossroads. The land was smaller now, the people were crowded closer together, and the old ways of chasing the herds were becoming harder to sustain. In the Near East, in a crescent of fertile land tucked between the mountains and the desert, a new idea was taking root, not yet a shout, but a whisper. It was an idea about staying put. It was an idea about stone. It was an idea that would end the lost epoch and begin the noisy, messy story of history. But for now, we linger one last moment by the shore, listening to the waves lap against a beach that wasn't there yesterday, feeling the salt spray on our faces, and mourning the silent, drowned continent that sleeps forever beneath the keel of the fishing boats. The land is gone, but the ghost of the land remains, haunting the edge of the human imagination. When the waters of the great drowning finally stabilized, covering the continental shelves and turning plains into seabeds, the physical crisis ended. But a new psychological crisis began. How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you tell your children that the world used to be bigger? This is where the silence of the lost epoch begins to murmur, where the hard facts of geology dissolve into the fluid, dreamlike logic of myth. We are entering the era of the great remembering, or perhaps the great forgetting. It is the moment when history, lacking the anchor of the written word, drifts into the realm of legend. We tend to treat the flood myths of the world, the stories of Noah, of Utnapishtim, of Manu, of the Gunyu floods in China, as separate, isolated fairy tales or as theological metaphors about sin and punishment. We sit in our dry, climate-controlled rooms and analyze them as literature. But if we listen closely, with the ear of the archaeologist and the heart of the survivor, we hear something else entirely. We hear a collective scream echoing from the end of the Ice Age. These stories are not inventions, they are memories. They are the trauma of the rising sea, distilled and preserved in the amber of oral tradition for 500 generations. Consider the mechanism of this memory. In a world without books, a story is a living thing. It must be memorable to survive. It must have a rhythm, a hero, a villain, and a lesson. A slow, creeping rise in sea level that takes 3 lifetimes to swallow a village is a tragedy, but it is not a good story. It is too slow, too boring for the firelight. So, over centuries of retelling, the slow creep is compressed. The rising tide becomes a great wave. The years of rain become 40 days and 40 nights. The complexity of a changing climate is simplified into the anger of a god. The memory is sharpened into a weapon of warning. It brings a gentle, empathetic smile to think of a grandfather, thousands of years ago, trying to make his restless grandchildren listen. He cannot show them a chart of sea levels. He cannot explain the melting glaciers, so he tells them about the time the water got angry. He tells them about the ancestors who built a great boat. He turns the physics of the planet into a story about behavior, because behavior is something humans can control. If the flood was a punishment, then maybe, just maybe, if we are good, it won't happen again. It is a comforting lie born of a terrifying truth. Across the globe, the similarities in these stories are not a coincidence of imagination. They are a coincidence of experience. The ice melted everywhere. The water rose everywhere. In Australia, Aboriginal oral traditions, some of the oldest continuous stories on Earth, speak accurately of coastlines that have been underwater for 7,000 years. They describe islands that are now reefs and walks across land that is now deep ocean. These are not myths. They are navigational charts of the lost epoch, preserved in song. In the Near East, the story is darker, more violent. Many researchers believe that the Black Sea was once a freshwater lake, separated from the Mediterranean by a natural dam at the Bosporus. As the sea levels rose, that dam eventually breached. The water didn't just trickle in, it roared. It is estimated that 10 cubic miles of water poured into the Black Sea every day, 200 times the flow of the Niagara Falls, transforming the lake into a sea and driving tens of thousands of people from their homes. This was a real event, a cataclysm that happened in the lifetime of a single generation. Is it any wonder that the cultures of that region, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Hebrews, all share a story of a catastrophic flood? It is the scar tissue of their civilization. These myths also give us a glimpse into what was lost. They almost always speak of a golden age before the flood, a time when people lived longer, when the earth gave fruit without toil, when gods walked with men. We usually dismiss this as nostalgia, but through the lens of the Lost Epoch, it makes perfect sense. The Golden Age was the time before the cold of the Younger Dryas, or perhaps the rich, fertile life on the lost coastlines like Doggerland. To the survivors huddled on the rocky, scrubby hills, the memory of the lush, drowned lowlands would indeed feel like a paradise lost. They were remembering a better world, a world where the hunting was easy and the winters were mild, a world that the water had taken away. This longing for the past is the emotional engine of the myth. It is the grief of a displaced people who can never go home because home is under 100 feet of salt water. The persistence of these stories tells us something profound about the human capacity for information storage. We often underestimate the power of the oral web. We think that without writing, accuracy is impossible. But in the Lost Epoch, the storyteller was the keeper of the tribe's soul. Accuracy was not about dates and times, it was about the truth of the experience. To change the story was to betray the ancestors. There were checks and balances, rhythmic structures and rhymes that locked the memory in place. A story could travel unchanged for 1,000 years, passed like a precious coal from one mind to another. However, the details do blur. The monster that caused the flood changes from a shifting glacier to a vengeful serpent. The boat changes from a raft to a massive ark. The survivors shrink from a whole tribe to a single chosen family. This filtering process is fascinating. It strips away the specific geography and leaves only the universal emotion. By the time these stories were finally written down in clay tablets in Mesopotamia, thousands of years later, they had been polished into perfect, smooth gems of narrative. They had ceased to be history and had become theology. But the core remains: the fear of the water, the fragility of the dry land, the sense that we are living on borrowed time. This is the legacy of the Section 8. We are the children of the survivors. We are the descendants of the ones who ran for the hills when the water rose. That fear is baked into our cultural DNA. It is why we are still fascinated by disaster movies, by stories of the apocalypse. We are rehearsing the memory of the Lost Epoch. The silence of this time is deceptive. It is actually very loud if you know how to listen to the stories we tell our children. It is a noise that has been traveling through the human voice for 10 millennia. And as we sit here, safe and dry, it is humbling to realize that the coastline is still changing. The story isn't over. The water is still resting, heavy and patient, against the shores of our confidence. The myths of the flood serve as a warning from the deep past. Do not get too comfortable. The earth is dynamic. The map is a snapshot, not a painting. The ancestors learned this the hard way, and they sent a message forward in time, wrapped in the protective coating of a fairy tale, hoping that one day we would be smart enough to decode it. They are telling us that the solid ground beneath our feet is a gift, not a guarantee. And as the fire burns low and the shadows stretch out, we can almost hear the sound of that ancient rising tide, a ghostly echo reminding us to respect the water and to remember the world that lies beneath it. The water recedes and the story moves inland, away from the drowned coasts and into the golden sun-baked hills of what we now call the Levant. Here, in the curve of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, something unprecedented is happening. It is not a revolution that begins with a shout, but one that begins with a heavy grinding sound, the sound of stone against stone, rhythmic and endless, echoing through the oak forests. We have arrived in the time of the Natufians, a people who exist in the twilight between the wild freedom of the hunter and the tethered labor of the farmer. They are the great experimenters of the Lost Epoch. If you were to walk up the slope of Mount Carmel or peer into the caves of the Judean hills during this time, you would see something that would make a pure nomad stop and stare in confusion. you would see walls, not the temporary windbreaks of brush and skin that vanish with the season, but low circular walls built of limestone rocks, carefully stacked and mortared with clay. These are the first permanent footprints of humanity. For hundreds of thousands of years, the rule of survival was mobility. Do not attach yourself to a place, for the herds will move and the berries will rot. But the Natufians broke the rule. They looked at a hillside rich with wild gazelle, teeming with pistachios and almonds, and covered in shimmering fields of wild barley and wheat, and they decided to stay. This decision changed the architecture of the human mind. Imagine the psychological shift of building a house that you intend to die in. Imagine the weight of a stone mortar, a massive basin carved from basalt, sitting in the center of the floor. You cannot put a 50-pound rock in a backpack. The moment you carve that stone, you are dropping an anchor. You are telling the earth, I am not just passing through. The Natufian settlements are bustling, noisy, smelly places, filled with a new kind of energy. They are not yet cities, not even villages really, but hamlets, clusters of round, semi-subterranean huts with roofs made of brush and oak branches. The floors are paved with flat stones. There are hearths that burn day and night. It brings a faint knowing smile to think of the first person who realized that by staying in one spot, they also had to invent the concept of house cleaning, sweeping the debris of life out the door instead of just walking away from it. But they are not farmers. This is the crucial, delicate distinction. They do not plant seeds. They do not plow the earth. They are complex hunter-gatherers, a term that feels too dry for the vibrancy of their lives. They are harvesting the wild abundance that grows naturally. They have invented a tool that glitters in the sunlight, the sickle. It is a curved handle of bone or horn embedded with a row of tiny razor-sharp flint blades called microliths. When used to cut the tough stalks of wild wheat, the silica in the plant polishes the flint to a mirror-like sheen, a sickle gloss that archaeologists can still see on blades found today, 10,000 years later. It is the signature of the harvest. The work is intense. To turn wild grass into food requires hours of labor, threshing, winnowing, and grinding the hard kernels into flour. The women and men of the Natufian culture likely spent a third of their lives bent over those quernstones, developing distinctive wear patterns on their bones, arthritis in their toes and knees from hours of kneeling. It was a hard trade, the freedom of the trail for the security of the granary. Yet, the forest is still their supermarket. They are masters of the gazelle hunt. The bones found in their middens tell us they hunted gazelle with an almost industrial efficiency, perhaps using great drive lines or nets to funnel herds into killing zones. They are living in a moment of balance, enjoying the best of both worlds, the protein of the hunt and the carbohydrates of the grain. And in this settled life, a new shadow appears at the edge of the firelight, one that steps closer than ever before. It is here, in the Natufian world, that the relationship between human and wolf undergoes its final beautiful alchemy into the bond between human and dog. We find the proof at a site called Ain Malaha, where a grave was opened to reveal the skeleton of an elderly woman. Her hand is resting gently on the body of a 6-month-old puppy. They were buried together, not as food, but as companions. This is not a utility. This is love. It is the first tangible evidence of a friendship that crosses the species barrier. It suggests that as humans settled down, they expanded their circle of empathy to include the animals that watch the perimeter. The dog was the perfect partner for the sedentary life, a guardian for the house, a helper in the hunt, a warm body in the cold limestone hut. One can imagine the noise of these settlements, the barking of dogs, the laughter of children who have never known what it is to pack up camp, the constant scrape, scrape, scrape of the grinding stones. But there is a darkness here too, a heaviness that comes with staying put. When you wander, you leave your dead behind, buried in a shallow grave on the trail, returned to the landscape. When you settle, the dead stay with you. The Natufians buried their ancestors right under the floors of their houses or in courtyards just outside the door. They were literally walking on the bones of their history. This created a powerful binding sense of lineage. You could not leave the house because grandfather was part of the foundation. The skull was often removed, decorated, perhaps displayed, a practice that seems macabre to us but was likely a gesture of profound respect, a way of keeping the wisdom of the elders present in the room. This focus on ritual and ancestry suggests a society that is becoming more complex, more stratified. There are hints of status. Some graves have beautiful necklaces of dentalium shells brought from the distant sea, while others have nothing. The innocence of the egalitarian band is beginning to fray. The LOST Epoch is starting to find its hierarchy, but this stability is fragile. The Natufians are flourishing during the warm, wet Billing Alarud period, but they are about to be hit by the sledgehammer of the younger Dryas. As the world cools and dries, the wild fields of grain that sustain them begin to shrink. The herds of gazelle thin out. The abundance that allowed them to settle is evaporating. This is the dramatic tension of the Natufian story. They have committed to a lifestyle that the climate is trying to evict them from. They are trapped by their own success. They have forgotten how to be pure nomads. They have too much stuff, too many heavy stones, too many ancestors in the floor. So when the food runs short, they don't walk away. They dig in. They work harder. They experiment more desperate with the plants, trying to encourage them to grow, trying to save the seeds, trying to coax life out of the drying soil. Some historians debate whether agriculture was a stroke of genius or a desperate fallback plan, a survival strategy for a people who had lost the option of running away. The Natufians are the protagonists of this tragedy. They are the ones who stood on the threshold of the modern world, holding a sickle in one hand and a spear in the other, feeling the cold wind of the returning ice age on their backs, and making the fateful decision not to retreat, but to manipulate the earth itself. They are the bridge builders. They built the first walls, they dug the first permanent graves, they loved the first dogs. And as the sun sets over the Judean hills, casting long shadows over their circular stone huts, we can feel the weight of their choice. They are pausing the great migration to build a home, unaware that in doing so, they are locking humanity into a trajectory of labor, property, and power that will never be reversed. The stone mortar sits heavy in the center of the room, a silent gravitational center that pulls the future towards it. The wild world is still out there, howling in the dark, but inside the circle of the wall, the air is still, and the first distinct settled dream of civilization is beginning to take shape in the smoke of the hearth. From the small, intimate stone circles of the Natufians, we must now travel north, crossing the spine of the ancient world into the high, wind-swept plateaus of southeastern Anatolia, to a place where the history of human ambition is rewritten in limestone. We are climbing a ridge known to the locals as Göbekli Tepe, the Potbelly Hill, a gentle rounded prominence that overlooks the vast dusty plains of Harran. For thousands of years, this hill was just a bump in the landscape, a place where farmers' plows would occasionally snag on a buried rock, a place ignored by the marching armies of later empires. But beneath the soil of this unassuming hill lies a secret that, when finally revealed, shattered the timeline of civilization. We are standing here around 9500 BCE. To orient yourself in time, you must understand how deep this is. We are 6,000 years before Stonehenge. We are 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. We are closer in time to the last mammoth than we are to the first pharaoh. According to the old textbooks, the humans of this era were simple nomads, wandering in small bands, incapable of anything more complex than a campfire and a temporary shelter. They were supposed to be too busy surviving to build. But the hill contradicts the textbooks. Here, rising out of the dust, are massive monolithic pillars arranged in perfect concentric circles. These are not rough, unshaped boulders rolled into place. They are architectural masterpieces. T-shaped pillars, carved from single blocks of limestone, stand up to 18 feet tall and weigh as much as 16 tons. They are smoothed, dressed, and fitted into terrazzo floors made of burnt lime that are polished to a waterproof hardness. It is a cathedral built by people who did not yet have a house. The existence of Göbekli Tepe is a smoking gun in the mystery of the Lost Epoch. It is an impossible object. It defies the logic of progression. We used to believe that the sequence of civilization was linear. First, you learn to farm. Then, you settle down in a village. Then, with a surplus of food, you develop a hierarchy. And finally, you build temples and monuments. Agriculture creates religion. But Göbekli Tepe suggests the reverse. There's no evidence of a permanent city here. There are no great trash heaps of domestic pottery, no hearths for baking daily bread for a large population. This was not a place to live. It was a place to visit. It was a pilgrimage site, a sanctuary on the edge of the world. This implies that the urge to worship, the urge to gather, the urge to build something greater than oneself came before the farm. It suggests that religion, or at least shared ritual, was the engine that pulled humanity out of the wild. Imagine the scene on this hill 11,000 years ago. It is a hive of organized chaos. Hundreds of people are gathering, coming from different tribes, speaking different dialects, perhaps traveling from hundreds of miles away. They are hunter-gatherers, people who spend their days tracking gazelle and gathering wild einkorn wheat. They have no beasts of burden, no oxen, no horses. They have no metal tools, no copper chisels, no bronze saws. They have no wheel. Yet, they are moving 16-ton stones uphill. How? The answer lies in the sheer power of the human collective. We can see them in the mind's eye. Teams of dozens, perhaps hundreds of men and women, pulling on ropes made of twisted fiber, chanting in rhythm to coordinate their heave. Heave, pause, heave. The sound of the hill is the sound of flint striking limestone, a high-pitched click-click-click that never stops, a chorus of thousands of stone chisels chipping away the bedrock to free the pillars. It is a work of unimaginable patience. To carve a single pillar with a flint tool would take months, to move it would take weeks, to build the entire enclosure would take years, and they didn't just build one. They built ring after ring, burying the old ones and building new ones on top, a constant cycle of creation and renewal that lasted for over a millennia. This required a social structure that we thought didn't exist yet. Someone had to plan the layout, someone had to feed the workers, someone had to mediate the disputes. This was the first great project of humanity, the first time we clocked in. It brings a sense of awe, and perhaps a little exhaustion, to think of the calories burned here. Without farming, how did they feed this army of stonemasons? The answer is found in the bones. The soil around the site is packed with the remains of gazelle, aurochs, and wild boar. These were not meager meals, they were feasts. It seems that Göbekli Tepe was the site of massive ritualistic barbecues. Perhaps the hunters brought their best kills here as an offering or as a tax. It was a place of excess in a world of scarcity. The T-shape of the pillars is distinct and abstract. They are not just structural supports, they are stylized humans. The horizontal bar at the top represents the head, the vertical shaft the body. On some pillars, you can see faint carvings of arms coming down the sides, hands with long fingers clasping the belly, belts and loincloths etched into the stone. They are faceless giants, silent watchers standing in a circle, looking inward at each other. Are they gods? Are they ancestors? Are they the first representation of the human as something separate from the nature around it? Standing in the center of one of these circles, surrounded by these silent stone elders, you would feel small. The walls would block out the landscape, forcing your gaze upward to the sky. At night, the circle of pillars would frame the stars, creating an observatory for the turning heavens. It is easy to imagine the smoke of the sacred fires rising, the sound of drums beating against the stone, the shaman's voice echoing off the walls. This was a theater of the spirit. It was a place where the scattered tribes of the region became a people. They were bound together not just by blood, but by a shared belief, a shared labor. The impossible pillars prove that the human mind was fully modern, fully capable of grand conceptual thinking, long before we had the technology to match it. We were dreamers before we were engineers. The mystery deepens when we realize that the stone used to build these pillars is limestone, a sedimentary rock formed at the bottom of the ancient seas. So these people were carving their gods out of the bones of a drowned world, lifting the seabed up to the sky. It is a poetic resonance with the flood myths, using the evidence of the water to anchor themselves to the land. But there is a tension here, a shadow. This was not a utopia. The labor required to build this was immense, perhaps coercive. Did everyone want to pull the rope? Or were some forced? Was this the beginning of the end of the egalitarian Eden, the moment when a priestly class began to tell the hunters what to do? The silence of the stones does not answer. We only know that they built and built and built. And the strangest thing of all is that the technology used to build Göbekli Tepe, the mastery of stone carving, the logistics of transport, seems to appear out of nowhere. There are no clumsy practice sites found yet. It is as if the knowledge arrived fully formed. This has led to wild theories, of course, ancient aliens, lost civilizations. But the truth is likely more grounded and more impressive. We simply haven't found the practice sites yet, or they were made of wood and have rotted away. The genius of Göbekli Tepe is human genius. It is the genius of the LOST Epoch finally making a mark that time cannot erase. It is a shout into the void. We are here, the pillars say. We can move mountains. As we walk among the ruins, touching the cold, rough surface of the limestone, we can feel the vibration of that ancient effort. We are standing in the delivery room of the modern world. This is where the deal was made. We traded the ease of the drift for the glory of the monument. We decided that leaving a mark was worth the sweat. And as the wind blows through the excavation site, kicking up the dust of 10,000 years, the faceless T-shaped giants stand their ground, guarding the secret of their origin, waiting for us to understand that the primitive past was never simple, and the silence was never empty. It was full of the sound of stone striking stone, building a stairway to the stars. If you run your hand along the cold, rough flank of a pillar at Göbekli Tepe, your fingers will eventually stumble upon a ridge, a line where the stone rises up to meet you. In the flickering light of a torch, or the beam of a modern flashlight, these ridges resolve into shapes, and the shapes resolve into nightmares. We are stepping now into the artistic soul of the LOST Epoch, a gallery carved not with ink or paint, but with the relentless subtraction of the living rock. The art of Göbekli Tepe is not the pastoral, peaceful imagery we might expect from the dawn of religion. There are no images of people holding hands, no scenes of harvest, no smiling gods. Instead, the limestone is crawling with teeth, stingers, and claws. It is a menagerie of the dangerous. As your eyes adjust to the shadows, you see them. Scorpions scuttling up the side of a pillar, their tails arched to strike. Spiders with thick etched legs, snakes, endless tangles of snakes, writhing in knots or flowing like rivers down the stone. Wild boars with tusks bared in eternal aggression. Foxes, cranes, and vultures. This is not a celebration of nature's bounty. It is a catalogue of nature's threat. It is as if the builders took everything that frightened them in the dark and trapped it in the stone, perhaps hoping that by capturing the image, they could control the beast. The technical skill required to create these images is staggering, enough to make a modern sculptor pause in respect. These are not simple scratchings or engravings like graffiti on a wall. They are low reliefs and high reliefs. To create a relief, you do not carve the animal, you carve the world away from the animal. You have to remove tons of limestone background, chipping away the negative space with nothing but a flint point, leaving the creature standing proud, raised from the surface. It is a process of immense discipline. One slip of the chisel, one crack in the wrong place, and the entire pillar is ruined. There is no eraser in limestone. On one pillar, a predator, perhaps a lion or a leopard, is carved in high relief, meaning it stands almost completely free of the background, its body muscular and three-dimensional, looking for all the world like it is about to leap off the rock and into the room. It brings a shiver to the spine to imagine standing in this enclosure 11,000 years ago with only a flickering oil lamp for light. In that shifting illumination, the animals would not look static. The shadows would dance, the snakes would seem to writhe, the scorpion would seem to crawl. The temple was designed to be a living hallucination, a place where the stone itself was alive with the spirits of the wild. But why these animals? Why fill a sanctuary with scorpions and vultures? Historians and archaeologists still debate this with hushed fascination. Some argue that these are totems, the spirit animals of the different clans that gathered here, the boar clan, the snake clan, the fox clan. In this view, the pillars are like diplomatic treaties signed in stone marking the gathering of different tribes. Others see something far more cosmic. They suggest that the pillars are a library of the sky, a star map of the lost epoch. The scorpion might not be an insect, but the constellation Scorpio. The bull might be Taurus. The vulture might be Cygnus. If this is true, then Göbekli Tepe is a machine for tracking time, a stone computer built to monitor the precession of the equinoxes and the movement of the heavens. It is a dizzying thought that these primitives were looking up with the same mathematical curiosity that we direct at the stars today. The most chilling and complex carving is found on Pillar 43, often called the vulture stone. Here, the imagery takes a turn toward the macabre. A large vulture holds a circular object on its wing, perhaps the sun, perhaps a soul. Below it, a headless man. It is a scene that likely depicts the ancient practice of excarnation, or sky burial. In this rite, the dead were not buried in the ground. They were laid out on high platforms to be picked clean by birds of prey. The vultures were considered the angels of the Paleolithic, the sacred vessels that carried the spirit from the flesh of the earth to the freedom of the sky. To see this carved so explicitly suggests a profound and specific theology regarding death. It tells us that these people had a story about where they went when they died, and that story involved the birds. The art of Göbekli Tepe also features strange, cryptic symbols that look unsettlingly familiar. Along the top of Pillar 43, there are 3 carvings that look exactly like handbags, square purses with arched handles. We see similar handbag motifs in ancient art from Assyria, from the Olmecs in Mexico, from cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Pseudo-historians love these bags, claiming they prove ancient advanced technology or global travel. But the truth is likely more grounded and more human. A basket is a universal object. It is the symbol of gathering, of holding, of bringing an offering. Perhaps these handbags are simply stylized baskets containing the gifts brought to the gods, the fat of the gazelle, the grain of the wild wheat. It brings a faint, weary smile to think of how we project our own sci-fi fantasies onto their simple, sacred objects, turning a basket of grain into an astronaut's life support system, because we cannot believe they were just grateful for dinner. There is also a distinct absence in the art. There are almost no women. In the Paleolithic caves of Europe, painted thousands of years earlier, female figures, the so-called Venus figurines, are common, celebrating fertility and life. But at Göbekli Tepe, the energy is masculine, aggressive, phallic. The pillars themselves are often interpreted as abstract phalluses. The animals are male. It feels like a shift in the social order, a move away from the mother goddess worship of the deep caves toward something harder, sharper, more patriarchal. Is this the moment men seized the narrative of the divine? Or is this simply a male clubhouse, while the women had their own sanctuary made of wood or cloth that has long since rotted away? We cannot know. We only have the stone. And the stone speaks of a deep, vibrating tension between man and nature. In the older cave paintings of Lascaux or Chauvet, the animals are painted with love, floating in a dreamscape. Here, the animals are contained. They are stuck on the pillar. They are subordinated to the architecture. This is a subtle but monumental shift in human psychology. It is the beginning of the concept of domestication, not of the animal's body, but of its image. By carving the fox into the stone, we are saying, I see you. I know you. I own your image. It is a step toward the mindset of the farmer who controls the wild. The sensory experience of creating this art must have been deafening. The tap-tap-tap of the chisels would have echoed across the valley for years, a constant reminder of the project's importance. The dust would have coated the workers' lungs. The stone chips would have cut their feet. This was not art for art's sake. This was art as an act of survival. They believed that by carving these stones, they were keeping the world in balance. They were appeasing the angry spirits of the younger Dryas. They were buying insurance against another freeze, and in a way, it worked. The culture that built these pillars survived. They endured the cold. They eventually learned to tame the wheat that grew on the hillsides. But the art remains a frozen scream from a time of transition, a testament to the fear and awe that our ancestors felt when they looked out into the dark. The vulture is still there, waiting on Pillar 43, holding the sun on its wing, a silent guardian of a mystery that we are only just beginning to learn how to read. The images are not meant to be pretty, they are meant to be powerful. And even now, stripped of their paint, worn by the wind, buried for 10,000 years and dug up again, they still have the power to make us stop and look and feel the weight of a gaze that is not human. Now we must turn our backs on the stone pillars for a moment and look down at the ground, at the dry golden grass that crunches beneath our boots. In the shadow of the great sanctuary, a quiet revolution is taking place, one that is far more dangerous and enduring than the carving of any monolith. We are standing at the epicenter of the single greatest change in the history of our species, and it is happening not with a bang, but with the soft rustle of wind through the stalks of wild einkorn wheat. For generations, the story of civilization was taught in a very specific order. First, humans learned to farm. Then, because they had a surplus of food, they settled into villages. And finally, with bellies full and time on their hands, they built temples and organized religion. The farm created the god. It was a logical, pragmatic progression, but Göbekli Tepe has grabbed that timeline by the ends and twisted it into a circle. The evidence on this windy hill suggests the exact opposite. The god created the farm. Think about the logistics of the construction site we just left. You have hundreds of workers, stone carvers, rope pullers, wall builders, shamans, gathered in one place for months at a time. They are burning thousands of calories a day, moving 16-ton limestone blocks. They cannot simply wander off into the woods to hunt every afternoon. The work would never get done. And the local gazelle herds, no matter how vast, would eventually be depleted by such a hungry crowd. To build a temple, you need a cafeteria. You need a reliable, storable, energy-dense fuel source that stays put. The hunger of the gods drove the innovation of the menu. And so, the hillsides around the sanctuary became a laboratory. We know from genetic analysis, the molecular memory of the plants themselves, that the 68 distinct varieties of modern wheat grown today all trace their ancestry back to a specific type of wild grass that grows on the Karakata Shield volcano just 20 miles from Göbekli Tepe. This is the ground zero of agriculture. It brings a wry, gentle smile to think that the entire edifice of modern civilization, from the sandwich in your hand to the economy of nations, might have started simply because a group of hunter-gatherers needed a steady supply of snacks for their church social. But the process was not immediate. It was a slow, stumbling seduction. The people did not wake up one morning and decide to become farmers. They were complex foragers, gathering the wild grain that grew naturally in dense stands. But here's the trick. The botanical lock that had to be picked. Wild wheat is designed to shatter. Its stalk, or rachis, is brittle. When the wind blows or a deer brushes past, the stalk snaps and the seeds scatter onto the ground to propagate. This is great for the wheat, but terrible for the human who wants to harvest it. If you touch wild wheat, it falls apart before you can get it into your basket. You end up with a handful of stems and a pile of lost dinner in the dirt. However, in every field of millions of stalks, there is a tiny, random genetic mutation. A few freak stalks have a tough, non-shattering rachis. They hold onto their seeds even when ripe. In the wild, these mutants are failures. They cannot reproduce because they never drop their seeds. But when a human comes along with a sickle, looking for the easiest stalks to cut, they unknowingly select these freak plants. They cut them, carry them back to the village, thresh them, and, crucially, spill some of the seeds on the path or around the granary. Next year, what grows in the camp? The mutant wheat. The wheat that waits for the human. Over centuries of this unconscious selection, the wheat changes. It loses its ability to reproduce on its own. It enters into a marriage contract with humanity. It says, "I will feed you if you promise to carry me, plant me, and protect me." And we said yes. We are not just domestication the plants are domesticating us. We are being tethered to the soil. This is the birth of the founder crops: emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas. They all appear in this region, in this lost epoch, like a sudden explosion of culinary distinctness. And what were they doing with all this grain? They weren't just making porridge. There is a delightful, slightly scandalous theory among archaeologists called the beer before bread hypothesis. Embedded in the floors of the limestone enclosures at Göbekli Tepe and nearby sites, researchers have found massive stone vats, huge basins that could hold 40 gallons of liquid. Chemical analysis suggests they contained oxalates, the residue of fermentation. It is entirely possible that the driving force behind the agricultural revolution was not the need for bread, but the need for beer. A mild, low-alcohol beer would have been a safe source of hydration, a sterile alternative to questionable river water, and, importantly, a social lubricant for the great ritual gatherings. Imagine the scene: the fires roaring, the drums beating, the stars wheeling overhead, and the community sharing a communal vat of fermented wild gruel, dissolving the tensions between rival clans in a haze of mild intoxication. If the temple brought them together, the brew might have kept them from killing each other. This shifts the tone of the epic from a desperate struggle for survival to a gathering of celebration. But there is a trap hidden in the golden stalks. Once you start relying on the grain, you cannot stop. The population grows because the calories are abundant. More people means you need more grain. You have to clear more land. You have to stay and weed the fields. You have to build walls to protect the harvest from the wild goats and the envious neighbors. The trap of agriculture snaps shut. You can no longer walk away. You have traded the lightness of the nomad for the heavy burden of the surplus. The silence of the hunter waiting in the woods is replaced by the rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of the cornstone, the sound of women grinding grain for hours a day, effectively destroying their knees and backs to feed the village. We see this in the skeletons of the time, the arthritis, the wear patterns. The transition to farming was not a physiological upgrade. In fact, early farmers were shorter, sicker, and died younger than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. But there were more of them. The machine of civilization had started, fueled by starch. And right there, in the shadow of the carved pillars, the great conceptual shift occurs. The land is no longer a parent that provides, it is a factory that must be managed. We begin to clear the forests. We begin to alter the flow of water. We begin to classify plants as crops, good, or weeds, bad. We are imposing our will on the chaotic tapestry of the biosphere. The sanctuary on the hill, with its stone circles, was the anchor that held us in place long enough for the wheat to capture us. It is a profound irony. We built the temple to reach the sky, but the effort forced us to look down at the dirt forever. The lost epoch is the time when humanity fell in love with control. We controlled the stone, and then we controlled the seed. And as the fields of domesticated grain spread out from the foothills of Anatolia, rippling across the Middle East like a slow green fire, the old world of the open steppe and the free-roaming band began to suffocate. The fences were going up. The borders were being drawn. The gods of the hunt, the wild lion and the swift gazelle, were being pushed to the margins, replaced by the gods of the harvest, who demanded labor, rain, and the eternal cycle of the seasons. We are still living in that cycle today. Every time you eat a slice of bread, you are participating in a ritual that began 11,000 years ago on a Turkish hillside, where a hungry stonemason reached out, plucked a stalk of mutant grass, and accidentally changed the world. The sun beats down on the dry earth, the wind rustles the chaff, and the heavy stone rollers of history begin to turn, crushing the past into the flower of the future. And then, After 1,500 years of continuous use, after centuries of carving, dancing, and praying, the people of the Lost Epoch did something even more baffling than building the temple. They decided to kill it. We have arrived at the Great Burying, the most mysterious closing act in the theater of prehistory. Usually, when civilizations end, they end in fire. Cities are sacked by invading armies, walls are pulled down by earthquakes, or roofs collapse under the weight of abandonment and rot. But Göbekli Tepe did not die a natural death. It was not destroyed by enemies. It was not surrendered to the jungle. It was erased by its own creators. Around 8,000 BCE, the communities that had spent generations worshipping on this hill made a collective decision to cover it up. They did not just throw a tarp over it, they buried it under a mountain of soil, stone chips, and refuse. This was an engineering project almost as massive as the construction itself. Imagine the scene. Thousands of people, perhaps the children of the very masons who carved the vultures, now marching up the hill with baskets of dirt on their backs. They are not repairing the walls, they are drowning them in earth. They are filling the sacred circles, shovelful by shovelful, packing the dirt tight against the limestone reliefs. They are suffocating the scorpions, blinding the foxes, burying the memory of the stone giants. It is an act of supreme finality. The volume of material required to do this is staggering, enough debris to fill a football stadium. They hauled this earth from the valleys below, carrying the landscape up the hill to create an artificial belly that would swallow the gods. Why? The silence of the archaeological record on this question is deafening. It is the ultimate whodunit of deep time. Why would a culture spend immense resources to build a cathedral only to spend equally immense resources to hide it? Some historians whisper that it was an act of fear. Perhaps the gods had failed them. Perhaps the climate had shifted again, or a disease had struck, and the people believed the stone watchers had turned malicious. To protect themselves, they had to imprison the spirits, sealing them deep underground where they could do no more harm. Others suggest it was a change in theology, a reformation. As the people transitioned fully from hunting to farming, the old wild gods of the beast world were no longer relevant. The farmer does not need the blessing of the vulture or the lion. The farmer needs the blessing of the rain and the sun. The old symbols were dangerous, chaotic, too tied to the blood and the wild. They had to be put away to make room for the new, orderly gods of the field. It is a funeral for an era. There is a strange tenderness in the burial, however. They did not smash the pillars. They did not deface the art. They packed them in soft soil, preserving them perfectly. It feels less like a murder and more like a time capsule. It brings a gentle, wondering thought to mind. Did they think they were coming back? Did they bury the temple to protect it from a perceived threat, intending to uncover it when the danger had passed? If so, they forgot. The memory of the location faded. The hill became just a hill, a gentle curve in the landscape where shepherds grazed their flocks, completely unaware that they were walking on the heads of giants. For 10,000 years, the site slept in absolute darkness, protected by the very dirt that was meant to erase it. This burial is the reason we have the site today. If they had left it open, the limestone would have eroded, the stones would have been stolen for local houses, and the art would have vanished. By trying to hide it, they saved it. It is the supreme irony of the Lost Epoch. But the act of burying suggests a profound psychological shift in the human experience. It marks the moment when we began to curate our own history. We decided what to keep and what to cover. We began to edit the past. The people who walked away from the buried hill were different from the ones who had arrived there. They were no longer looking up at the stars through the circle of stones. They were looking down at the furrow of the plow. They were leaving the age of magic and entering the age of management. The closing of Göbekli Tepe coincides with the full establishment of agriculture in the region. The wild was being fenced out. The animals that had once been gods were now being turned into livestock. The pig was domesticated. The sheep was tamed. The cattle were broken to the yoke. You cannot worship a cow and eat it too, or at least the relationship becomes complicated. So the master of animals, depicted on the pillars, had to be retired. The wildness had to be buried so that civilization could be born. As the last basket of earth was dumped on the summit, creating the final contour of the Potbelly Hill, the people turned their backs on the sanctuary. They walked down into the valleys, into the square houses and the walled villages, leaving the round open temples behind. They chose the security of the harvest over the mystery of the hunt. It is a poignant moment of departure. We can imagine an elder standing at the base of the hill, looking back one last time, knowing that the old ones were now sleeping in the dark, and that the story of humanity would essentially have to start over from scratch. The silence that descended on the hill was heavy and permanent. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a secret kept too well. The knowledge of what the pillars meant, the names of the gods, the rituals of the sky burials, all of it was suffocated by the soil. It did not transfer to the new world. This is the true tragedy of the Lost Epoch, the break in the chain. The wisdom of the hunter-gatherer, the complex star maps, the deep ecological philosophy, it was all packed away in the hill and left behind. The farmers who inherited the earth were richer in food, but perhaps poorer in spirit. They had bread, but they had lost the conversation with the cosmos that their ancestors had carved into the rock. And so, the hill sat there, baking in the sun, beaten by the rain, waiting. Empires rose and fell around it. The Hittites, the Assyrians, the Romans, the Ottomans. They all marched past, never suspecting that the oldest temple in the world lay just beneath the grass. The burial was successful. The gods were forgotten. But in the deep, cool earth, the scorpion and the vulture waited, their eyes wide open in the dark, preserving the testimony of a time when humanity was wild, terrified, and magnificent. The silence of the burial is a protective blanket, a lullaby of dust that kept the nightmare and the dream safe until we were ready to remember. The wind blows over the artificial mound, whispering through the dry grass, carrying the secret of the lost epoch to a world that has only just begun to listen again. The era of the stone circles is over. The era of the wall is about to begin. The people are moving to the river, to the oasis, to the places where they can build something that does not need to be buried but defended. And so the trap snaps shut, softly, without the clang of metal bars, but with the gentle rustling whisper of the golden grass. We have entered the era of the great entrapment. The burial of the temple on the hill was the closing ceremony of the old world. What follows is the hard, sun-baked reality of the new one. This is the period where humanity realizes, perhaps too late, that the deal we made with the plants is not entirely in our favor. We often call this the agricultural revolution, a phrase that sounds heroic and progressive, like an upgrade in software. But to the people living through it, it must have felt more like a slow constriction of the soul. For 200,000 years, human life was defined by the horizon. If the food ran out, you walked. If the water dried up, you moved. If the neighbors became aggressive, you left. Freedom was the primary survival strategy. But the moment you clear a field, plant a seed, and water it, you forfeit that freedom. You cannot leave. You are held hostage by a root system that goes only a few inches into the dirt. You must stay to weed. You must stay to water. You must stay to scare away the birds. You have traded the vast, infinite map of the hunter for a singular, immovable patch of soil. The world shrinks from a continent to an acre. This tethering creates a new kind of human anxiety, the anxiety of the future. The hunter lives in the eternal present. The deer is either there or it isn't. The farmer lives in the terrifying hypothetical of tomorrow. Will the rains come next month? Will the locusts swarm next summer? Will the frost kill the seedlings? For the first time, humanity begins to mortgage its peace of mind against the promise of a harvest that is months away. We begin to worry. We begin to hoard. We begin to count. The surplus of grain, the piles of wheat and barley stored in the cool darkness of the granary, is both a blessing and a curse. It allows the population to explode. A field can feed 10 times more people than a forest. But it also creates something that never existed before: poverty. In the hunter-gatherer world, you cannot really be poor because you cannot really own anything you can't carry. Everyone is equal in their emptiness. But with the granary comes the possibility of the empty bowl. If your crop fails while your neighbor's succeeds, suddenly there is a hierarchy, there is debt, there is theft. It brings a somber, heavy realization to see that the very invention that saved us from starvation also introduced us to inequality. The physical toll of this golden grass trap is etched into the skeletons of the LOST Epoch. The bones of these early farmers tell a story of grinding, repetitive agony. The hunters were tall, robust, with bones dense from varied movement. The farmers are shorter, their bones showing signs of malnutrition and stress. Their teeth are ground down by the grit in the stone-milled flour. Their backs are bent from the hoe. We worked harder for our calories than our ancestors ever did. We became the servants of the wheat. And yet, we could not stop. This is the insidious nature of the trap. Once the population grew on the diet of starch, we could not go back to hunting. There were too many mouths to feed. The forest could no longer support us. We had burned the bridge to the wild. We were committed to the plow. This shift changed our relationship with time itself. The hunter's time is the cycle of the moon and the migration of the herd, fluid, flexible. The farmer's time is rigid. It is the solar calendar. It is the precise calculation of the solstice. If you plant too early, you lose everything. If you harvest too late, you lose everything. This demanded a new kind of leadership, a class of people who could read the sky and tell the others when to work. The calendar keepers began to rise, the proto-priests who held the knowledge of the seasons. They did not need to hunt. Their power came from the information they held. The silence of the night was no longer just for sleeping. It was for calculating. The stars became a clock that governed the labor of the day. And as the fields expanded, pushing the forests back, the landscape began to change. The wild, chaotic biodiversity of the LOST Epoch was replaced by the monoculture of the crop. We began to paint the world in a single color, gold. This simplification of nature made us vulnerable. A single disease could wipe out the entire food supply. A single drought could topple a civilization. We had put all our eggs in one basket, and then we put that basket in a field waiting for the rain. But amidst the toil, there was a new kind of beauty emerging. The home became a permanent sanctuary. For the hunter, a shelter is a temporary skin. For the farmer, the house is a legacy. We see the rise of mud brick architecture, of plastered walls, of courtyards where families would gather for generations. The concept of home as a fixed coordinate in the universe takes root. The grandmother could plant a fig tree knowing that her grandson would eat its fruit. There is a profound emotional depth to this long-term thinking, a sense of building something that will outlast the self. The trap also forged a new intimacy with the animals we didn't eat, or rather, didn't eat immediately. The domestication that began with the dog expanded to the goat, the sheep, the pig, the cow. We brought the wild into the living room. We lived with the breath of the beasts in our ears. We drank their milk, a biological hack that required us to evolve the ability to digest lactose as adults. We wore their wool. We became a hybrid society, half human, half herd. But this closeness brought invisible enemies. The diseases of the animals jumped to the humans: smallpox, influenza, measles. These were the gifts of the barnyard, the plagues that would haunt history for millennia. The farmer was not just fighting the weeds, he was fighting the invisible biology of the crowd. Yet, the population continued to climb. The villages grew into towns. The noise of humanity got louder. The silence of the LOST Epoch was being filled with the sounds of construction, of commerce, of argument. And as the granaries filled, a new problem arose. The surplus was a magnet. In the wild, you cannot steal a hunter's skill, but you can steal a farmer's grain. The golden grass was wealth, and wealth attracts predators, not the wolves of the forest, but the wolves of the neighboring tribe. The open, undefended villages of the early experiment began to feel unsafe. The horizon, once a source of wonder, became a source of threat. Who is coming over that hill? What do they want? The anxiety of the harvest morphed into the anxiety of defense. The neighbors were no longer just potential trading partners, they were potential raiders. The trap had one final closing mechanism. It forced us to build barriers. We had to protect the investment. The ground we had watered with our sweat became sacred ground worth killing for. The first wars were not fought over ideology or religion, they were fought over the silo. And so, the shovel that was invented to turn the soil was eventually repurposed to dig the trench. The hand that learned to sow the seed learned to stack the stone. The people of the golden grass looked at their flat, open fields and realized they were naked. They needed a shield. They needed a shell. And in the Jordan Valley, at a place near a bubbling spring, the fear of the loss of the harvest coalesced into a monumental decision. They would not run. They would not hide. They would build a mountain of their own, a ring of stone that would say to the world, "This is ours. You cannot have it." The era of the open hand was ending. The era of the clenched fist was beginning. The wind blows across the wheat fields, rippling the golden surface like a sea, hiding the hard reality that beneath the beauty lies a contract written in sweat, binding us to the earth forever. We are no longer guests in the garden, we are its caretakers and its prisoners. In the deepest valley on earth, where the air is thick and heavy and the sun hammers the ground with a relentless white heat, a new shape rises from the dust. We are standing in the Jordan Rift Valley, nearly 1,000 feet below sea level, at an oasis that has been flowing since the beginning of memory. This is the place we will eventually call Jericho, but to the people of the Lost Epoch, it is simply the spring. It is a jewel of green in a landscape of brown, a riot of palm trees and fruit-bearing scrub that smells of water and life. And because it is so beautiful, because it is so rich, it is dangerous. The logic of the trap we just witnessed leads inevitably to this moment. If you have something worth keeping, you must build something to keep it in. Around 8000 BCE, the people of this oasis commit themselves to a project that has no precedent in human history. They decide to wrap their world in stone. They build a wall. But this is not the low, polite boundary of a garden. This is a fortification. It is 12 feet high, 6 feet thick, built of massive unmortared boulders hauled from the riverbed. To build it requires thousands of days of labor, thousands of bruised hands, thousands of meals cooked for the workers. It is a consumption of energy that screams of desperation or dominance. And built into this wall is a structure that still baffles the modern mind. A massive stone tower. It is a cylinder of solid rock, 30 feet in diameter and 26 feet high. It is not a house, it is not a granary, it is a machine for seeing. Inside the solid core of the tower, the builders carved a staircase, 22 smooth, steep steps leading from the bottom to the top. It brings a claustrophobic shiver to imagine climbing those stairs in the pitch black, running your hand along the cool, rough limestone, ascending through the heart of the stone to emerge into the blinding light of the summit. This staircase is the oldest in the world. It is the first time humanity built a way to go up without climbing a tree or a cliff. But why? Was it a watchtower to spot the dust of approaching raiders? Was it a platform for the astronomers to track the shadow of the mountains against the solstices? Or was it a barrier against the dark, heavy floods of mud that sometimes rushed down the wadis after a storm? Historians still argue whether the wall was for military defense or flood control, but for the story of the human soul, it does not matter. The effect is the same. The wall created a binary world. For the first time, there was an inside and an outside. There was us and there was them. Before the wall, the horizon was open. You could walk until your legs gave out. Now, your world stopped at the stone. To live inside the wall was to be safe, to be civilized, to be part of the people of the spring. To be outside was to be a barbarian, a threat, a ghost in the wilderness. This architecture of separation changed the way we looked at strangers. A stranger was no longer a curiosity. They were a siege risk. The wall institutionalized fear. It made paranoia structural. It brings a faint, sad smile to think of the first time someone knocked on the gate, and the people inside had to decide whether to open it. That hesitation, that moment of assessing the threat, is the birth of politics. Inside this fortified shell, the culture of Jericho became intense, focused, and strange. The connection to the ancestors, which we saw beginning with the Natufians, reached a fever pitch here. We find skulls, human skulls, that have been treated with a disturbing, loving care. The people would take the skulls of their dead, pack them with clay to recreate the face, insert cowrie shells for eyes, and paint the skin with ochre. They were rebuilding their grandfathers. These plastered skulls were likely kept in the homes, displayed on mantels, or buried beneath the floors. It seems that in a walled city, you never truly say goodbye. The dead are drafted into the defense of the living. They watch from the shelves, they watch from the floorboards. The city is a crowded place, shared by the breathing and the breathless. The psychological pressure of this existence must have been immense. Imagine living your entire life within a circle of stone, only a few acres wide. You know everyone. You know their secrets, their debts, their coughs in the night. There is no privacy in the first city. The social friction would be constant, requiring new rules, new taboos, new ways of managing conflict without violence. If you fight with your neighbor, you cannot just move your tent to the other side of the hill. You are stuck with him. So you invent law. You invent hierarchy. You invent the elder who sits at the base of the tower and decides who is right. The tower itself stands as a silent sentinel over this pressure cooker. It is the axis of the world. Standing on top of it, looking out over the shimmering heat haze of the valley, the guards would feel a sense of godlike power. They were high above the chaos. They could see the enemy coming days before they arrived. This elevation of perspective is a drug. Once we learned to look down on our surroundings from a constructed height, we never wanted to come down. We started building ziggurats, pyramids, castles, skyscrapers. The Tower of Jericho is the great-grandfather of every skyline on Earth. It is the first declaration that humanity is not content to crawl on the surface. We want to dominate the vertical. But walls work both ways. They keep the enemy out, but they keep the people in. The wall captures the labor force. It captures the mind. The people of Jericho were safe, yes, but they were also contained. The wild world was pushed back, out of sight, out of mind. The lion and the gazelle were now rumors, things that lived out there. The reality, in here, was the grinding of wheat, the plastering of walls, the climbing of stairs. The Lost Epoch is narrowing. It is focusing. It is trading the vast, terrifying freedom of the Ice Age for the cramped, sweaty security of the Citadel. And yet, there is a beauty in this determination. To build a wall is an act of hope. It is a statement that says, we are staying. We are not going to be washed away by the flood or scattered by the wind. We will make a place that remembers us. The stones of Jericho are still there today, worn by 10,000 years of wind, but still standing. You can still touch the rough surface of the tower. You can still peer down into the dark throat of the staircase. It is a testament to the stubbornness of the human desire for permanence. We are terrified of being forgotten. We are terrified of the silence. So we stack the stones higher and higher, trying to build a shout that will last forever. But as the sun sets behind the Judean hills, casting the shadow of the tower long across the valley floor, we can feel the isolation that comes with the fortification. The people inside the circle are warm, they are fed, they are together, but they are also cut off. They have severed the connection to the flow of the land. They have created a stagnant pool in the river of time. And in the stillness of the walled night, with the shell eyes of the ancestors gleaming in the firelight, the people of Jericho might wonder if the safety is worth the silence of the world beyond the gate. They have invented the city, and in doing so, they have invented the cage. The wind whistles over the top of the ramparts, a free thing mocking the stone, reminding them that everything they have built is just a temporary defiance of the dust. But for now, the wall holds, the tower watches, and the first citizens of the earth sleep soundly, believing that the stone will protect them from the night. As we move north again, leaving the harsh desert valley for the fertile rolling plains of central Anatolia, the idea of the city, undergoes a strange and claustrophobic mutation. We have arrived at Çatalhöyük, a place that looks like no city we know today. From a distance, it appears as a massive continuous mound of mud brick, a human-made anthill rising out of the wetlands. But as you get closer, you notice something unsettling. There are no streets. There are no alleys. There are no front doors. To enter this city, you must climb a ladder to the roof and drop down through a hole in the ceiling. We are entering the era of the hive mind. Around 7,000 BCE, nearly 10,000 people lived here, packed together in a density that rivals modern Manhattan. But instead of spreading out, they fused together. The houses are built back to back, wall to wall, a honeycomb of rectangular cells with no space in between. To visit your neighbor, you do not walk down the block. You walk across the rooftops, which served as the city's plazas, its workshops, and its highways. The roof was the public world of sun and wind. The house below was the private world of shadow and smoke. Inside these windowless rooms, the atmosphere is intense and ritualistic. The walls are plastered white, gleaming in the gloom, and then painted with vibrant, disturbing scenes, massive bulls hunting parties, vultures attacking headless men, and geometric patterns that dizzy the eye. But the most striking feature is not the paint, it is the furniture. The people of Çatalhöyük slept on raised platforms, slightly elevated above the dirty floor, and beneath these platforms, curled up in the fetal position, lay their dead. This is the ultimate expression of the ancestral tether we saw beginning in the Natufian period. Here, you literally sleep on top of your grandmother. You eat your dinner sitting above your dead child. The separation between the world of the living and the world of the dead has completely collapsed. The house is a tomb, and the tomb is a home. This suggests a psychology of profound continuity. Death is not a departure, it is just a move to the basement. The ancestors are the foundation, the literal support for the living sleeper. It creates a society where the past is physically present, exerting a constant silent pressure on the present. You can never truly be alone in a room full of ghosts, but the hive nature of Çatalhöyük goes deeper than architecture. It is a society of radical equality, or perhaps radical conformity. Archaeologists have excavated hundreds of houses, and they are all roughly the same size. There is no palace, there is no temple, there is no rich district or poor district. Every house is its own temple, with its own shrine, its own bullhorns plastered into the walls. It seems that the sacred was domestic. You didn't go to church, you lived in one. This lack of hierarchy is baffling. How do you organize 10,000 people without a king or a chief? The answer seems to be a complex, suffocating web of social rituals. It is a society held together by peer pressure. If everyone lives wall to wall, if everyone walks over everyone's roof, deviance is impossible. You are watched constantly. The eyes of the community are everywhere. It brings a shudder to imagine the intensity of the gossip, the social maneuvering, the sheer lack of privacy. To survive in Çatalhöyük, you had to suppress the individual self and become a cell in the larger organism. Life in the hive was smoky and intimate. The ovens had no chimneys, so the smoke simply drifted up to the roof hole, coating the lungs of the inhabitants with soot. We find soot in their rib cages. We find it in the layers of plaster on the walls. It was a dark, stinging existence, yet it was also filled with art. It was also. They made beautiful obsidian mirrors, polished to a black shine, perhaps to check their faces before climbing up to the roof world. They made figurines of heavy, seated women flanked by leopards, the famous seated woman of Çatalhöyük, images of power and fertility that suggest a reverence for the female form, contrasting with the phallic pillars of Göbekli Tepe. But the most fascinating mystery of the hive is its garbage. They were meticulously clean inside the house, constantly replastering the walls to keep them white. But outside, they dumped their trash in the abandoned houses next door or in the tiny gaps between neighborhoods. The city grew upward on layers of its own debris. They were living on a rising tide of history, quite literally standing on the refuse of the past. And then, there is the mystery of the history house. Some houses seem to have been burned down intentionally, filled with sand, and rebuilt exactly the same way on top, preserving the layout perfectly. It is a ritual closing, a way of renewing the cycle. But why? Was it to cleanse the house of bad spirits? Or was it simply that the house, like a person, had a lifespan, and when it died, it had to be buried properly? Çatalhöyük represents the peak of the Lost Epoch social experiment. It pushes the idea of community to its absolute limit. It asks the question, how close can we get? Can we live as one body? For over 1,000 years, they said yes. They thrived. They traded obsidian. They farmed the wetlands. They walked the rooftops under the Anatolian stars. But eventually, the hive broke. The city was abandoned. The people drifted away, perhaps tired of the smoke, tired of the crowding, or perhaps the social glue simply dried out. They moved to the open plains, to villages with streets and doors and privacy. They chose distance over density. It seems that humanity discovered there is a limit to how much togetherness we can handle. We need walls that separate us, not just walls that bind us. But the memory of the hive remains, a phantom city of mud and memory where the dead slept beneath the living and the people moved like bees across the surface of a singular, dreaming mind. We carry a piece of that hive in us still, the desire to be close, the fear of being too close, and the strange comfort of knowing that the ancestors are right there, just beneath the floorboards, holding us up. The walls of the city created safety, and the fields of the farm created surplus. But they also created a new problem. There was simply too much to remember. We have reached the twilight of the Lost Epoch, the moment when the vast invisible library of the human mind begins to close its doors. For tens of thousands of years, the entirety of human knowledge, every recipe for glue, every map of the star migration, every genealogy of the gods, every treaty between clans, was stored in the most fragile container imaginable, the wet gray matter of the living brain. It was a world of the oral web, a living internet of songs, rhymes, and rhythmic stories that connected the generations. In this world, a story was not a static thing sitting on a shelf. It was a performance, a physical act of breath and gesture. To know history, you had to be in the room where it was being sung. You had to feel the vibration of the elder's voice in your chest. But as the villages swelled into towns like Uruk and Susa, and the grain piled up in the silos, the capacity of the human memory began to buckle under the weight of the inventory. You can memorize the epic deed of a hero who stole fire from the sun, but it is much harder to memorize exactly how many bushels of barley neighbor Enki owes neighbor Ninsun after the flood ruined the lower field 3 years ago. The drama of survival was being replaced by the drudgery of accounting, and so the poets were pushed aside by the bean counters. We see the transition begin with something small and unassuming. The clay token. In the dust of the excavation sites across the Near East, archaeologists find thousands of tiny geometric shapes made of baked clay, cones, spheres, discs, cylinders. For a long time, these were ignored as game pieces or children's toys, but they are actually the first external hard drive. A cone might represent a small measure of grain, a sphere, a large measure, a cylinder, an animal. To keep a record of a transaction, you didn't write a contract. You gathered the specific tokens and sealed them inside a hollow ball of clay, a bulla. It was a receipt you could shake. If there was a dispute, you broke the ball open and counted the tokens. It brings a dry, sympathetic smile to think that the very first step toward the glorious history of literature was not a love poem or a prayer, but a way to make sure you didn't get cheated on a goat trade. But this system had a flaw. Once the ball was sealed, you couldn't check the contents without breaking it. So, some clever, lazy administrator, the patron saint of progress, decided to press the tokens into the wet surface of the clay ball before sealing it, leaving a negative impression. A picture of the cone, a picture of the sphere. And then, the realization struck like a lightning bolt. If you have the picture on the outside, you don't need the tokens on the inside. You don't even need the ball. You just need a flat tablet of wet clay and a reed stylus to draw the shape. In that quiet, bureaucratic moment, the lost epic received its eviction notice. The symbol was born, the sign was scratched, and the silence was broken. But as the clay tablet rises, the oral web begins to dissolve. This is the tragedy of the transition. We often celebrate the invention of writing as the beginning of history, but it was also the end of memory. When you write something down, you no longer need to remember it. The muscle of the mind, once capable of holding thousands of lines of verse, begins to atrophy. The ancient Greeks, looking back on this transition much later, told the myth of the god Thoth offering the gift of writing to the king of Egypt, who rejected it, saying, "This invention will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory." The king was right. We gained the archive, but we lost the internal encyclopedia. And what did we choose to record? We did not record the lullabies. We did not record the secret names of the stars. We did not record the recipe for the blue dye or the technique for softening the bison hide. We recorded taxes. We recorded lists of kings. We recorded the yields of the harvest. The early written record is incredibly boring. It is a spreadsheet of the ancient world. The rich, emotional, magical life of the lost epic, the stories of the shape-shifting bears, the songs of the rain summoning, the complex philosophy of the dream time, was not considered important enough for the clay. It was left to the oral tradition, which was slowly being devalued. The storyteller, once the most important person in the tribe, the keeper of the soul, became just an entertainer, an old man mumbling by the fire while the scribes worked in the temple, recording the real truth of numbers and laws. We must sit with the sadness of this erasure. The invention of writing acted like a filter. It caught the solid, bureaucratic particles of life, but let the fluid, emotional waters slip through. How many geniuses lived in the lost epic whose thoughts perished with their breath? How many Shakespeares sat by a campfire in the younger Dryas, spinning tales that made the whole tribe weep, only to be completely forgotten the moment the last listener died? The silence of prehistory is not a lack of events. It is a lack of the specific technology needed to capture the nuance of the human heart. The clay is cold. It cannot capture the tone of voice. It cannot capture the twinkle in the eye or the dramatic pause. It captures the what, but it loses the how. And as the script became more complex, evolving from simple pictures into the wedge-shaped abstractions of cuneiform, it became a specialized skill. The oral world was democratic. Everyone could speak. Everyone could listen. The written world was exclusive. Only the scribe, trained for years in the tablet house, could unlock the memory. The vast majority of humanity was locked out of their own history, dependent on a class of experts to tell them what was true. The word became a tool of power, of control, of law. It ceased to be a shared breath and became a fixed command. The fluidity of the myth, which could change to fit the needs of the moment, hardened into the dogma of the scripture. If it is written, it is true. If it is written, it cannot be changed. The playfulness of the lost epic was calcified into the rigidity of the list. We are still living in the shadow of this shift. We value the document over the testimony. We trust the paper more than the person. But in the quiet moments, when we read a child a bedtime story, or tell a joke to a friend, or sing a song in the car, we are briefly reconnecting with the old way. We are respinning a tiny thread of the oral web. We are remembering that the most important things, love, comfort, laughter, are rarely written down. They are felt and spoken and passed on in the dark. The sun is setting on the era of the silence. The scribes are busy in the temple, pressing their reeds into the wet river mud, creating a permanent record that will last for 5,000 years. They are writing the first sentence of history. But outside the temple walls, in the cooling twilight, the last true oral storyteller of the lost epic is finishing their song. The notes hang in the air for a moment, shimmering and beautiful, and then they drift away on the wind, uncaptured, unrecorded, returning to the silence from which they came. The epoch is over. The mystery is being traded for the certainty of the page. And as the voice fades, we are left with the clay, the stone, and the deep haunting feeling that we have forgotten something vital, something that the letters can never quite spell out. The long story of the Lost Epoch is complete, and we have arrived, at last, at the dawn of history, standing on the threshold where the silent memory of deep time meets the noisy certainty of the written page. We look back at the trail of dust, ice, and stone we have just walked, a trail that stretches 10,000 years, from the heavy crushing weight of the last glacial maximum to the light, precise scratch of the scribe's reed. What we have witnessed is not a gap, but a crucible, a time when the earth repeatedly tried to destroy the human project, and we, through desperate adaptation and a stubborn refusal to submit, grew harder, smarter, and more organized with every challenge. The Lost Epoch is gone, but it has not left us. We are the sum of its silent lessons. We carry the memory of the ice in our architecture, the fear of the flood in our mythologies, and the sheer tenacity of the nomad in our restlessness. The most profound realization is that the foundational elements of the modern world were all forged in that silent span, not as achievements of leisure, but as tools of survival under immense pressure. The wall of Jericho taught us sovereignty. The plastered skulls taught us ancestry, the beer vats taught us to gather, and the great burial of Göbekli Tepe taught us to close one chapter decisively so that the next could begin. The silence that defined the epic was never emptiness, it was just untranslated sound. It was a language spoken not through vowels and consonants, but through the shifting of animal migrations, the color of the sunset, the taste of the wild barley, and the rhythmic beat of the hammer striking the stone. We have spent the last hour learning to listen to that language, the language of material culture, of geology, and of genetics. It is a humble realization. For most of our existence, we were not the clever conquerors of the planet, but its intensely aware dependence, surviving by understanding the subtle rules of the environment with a fidelity that our technology has allowed us to forget. The tension between the myth and the fact remains a core legacy. The flood story that terrified us in Section 8 is a powerful, persistent emotional truth, even if the timing is blurred by millennia of oral retelling. It is the human heart's way of processing geological catastrophe. The dragons and monsters are simply the ghosts of the megafauna we hunted to extinction, passed down as warnings to keep us humble. The Lost Epoch is constantly reminding us that the deepest truths of the past are felt, not simply read. The shift that ended the silence, the invention of writing around 3200 BCE, was not an unambiguous triumph. It was a trade. We gained history, but we lost the communal reliance on memory. We gained the permanent record of the state, but we lost the fluid democratic poetry of the story. The clay tablets that finally emerge in Sumeria and Egypt, marking the official end of prehistory, are loud and clear, but they are also narrow. They tell us who was king and how much grain was taxed, but the essential question of the human spirit, why we chose to build the city, what it felt like to survive the cold, was left behind, buried with the silent pillars on the hill. So, as the light of the written word floods the stage of history, we carry with us the knowledge that the true story is always deeper than the record. The thousands of years of the Lost Epoch are not a void. They are the great reservoir of human resilience, the source code of our capacity to endure change. The world we live in now, with its constant demands for speed and information, often feels disconnected from that deep time past. But the echoes are everywhere. When we feel the deep, inexplicable urge to build a fire, or when we look up at the night sky and feel a sense of profound cosmic loneliness, or when a simple meal of bread feels like a sacred anchor, we are listening to the silence of the Lost Epoch. We are feeling the presence of the ancestors who huddled in the firs, watching the erratic stars, surviving the impossible night. They did not leave us a history book, but they left us the capacity to survive history. The story is not an ending, it is a cycle. We are still adapting. We are still building walls and debating what to bury. We are still trying to figure out what is essential and what is surplus. The silence of the Lost Epoch is a quiet mirror reflecting our own modern uncertainties. It teaches us that the greatest test of humanity is not what we build, but what we remember to pass on, and that sometimes the most important information is the hardest to write down. The heavy weight of the past lifts gently. The long night is over. The dawn is coming, and with it, the loud, messy complexity of the recorded world. But we know now where the quiet strengths were born. The long, continuous flow of the prehistory stream slows now. The water is calmer, reflecting the pale early light of the Holocene sun. We are moving out of the deep shadows of the lost epoch and into the familiar territory of civilization. Let the image of the great stone pillars sinking back into the earth, covered by the dry, protective dust, settle over you. Feel the tension drain from the bones of the ancient hunter, replaced by the heavy, settled comfort of the farmer who is finally home. The wind is just a whisper now, carrying no thread of ice, only the scent of warm, turned soil and distant wood smoke. The urgency of the past gives way to the patient reality of the present. Close your eyes and let the sheer scale of the time we just traveled wash over you, a time so vast that all of recorded history is just a thin, flickering candle on the edge of the darkness. You are safe. You are warm. You are tethered to the millions who came before you, the silent survivors who carved their dreams into the stone and passed their knowledge through the breath. The past is not gone. It is sleeping, waiting to be listened to again. Sweet dreams.